Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It was a crisp September morning in 2008 when my life changed forever. The sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest surrounding my cabin. I was running late, cursing under my breath as I hurriedly packed a small bag for my trip into town. A dentist appointment in Bend, a 2-hour drive from my secluded home in the Ochako National Forest, meant I'd have to forego my usual morning routine. Normally, I'd take my time savoring a hot breakfast while watching the mist rise from the nearby creek. It was one of the small pleasures I'd come to appreciate since moving out here, away from the noise and chaos of city life. But today, I had to settle for grabbing an energy bar and a bottle of water from my modest pantry. As I stepped outside, the cool air nipped at my skin, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. I paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of my surroundings. The towering evergreens stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. In the distance, I could hear the faint rustling of wildlife stirring awake. Most folks think living off the grid is crazy, but for me it's the only way to live. After spending over a decade in the military and a few more years bouncing between various security jobs, I'd had my fill of crowds, noise, and the constant hum of technology. The quiet of the forest suits me just fine. My setup here is simple but effective. A small array of solar panels provides most of my power needs, augmented by a reliable generator for cloudy days. A deep well ensures I always have clean water, and I grow a good portion of my own food in a carefully tended garden. It's not always easy, but it's a good life, one that allows me to be self-sufficient and at peace. The Ochako National Forest is rugged country, no doubt about it. Rolling hills covered in dense evergreen woods, with the occasional creek cutting through rocky terrain. My nearest human neighbors are miles away, which is exactly how I like it. Most of my day-to-day company consists of elk, deer, and the occasional black bear, all of which I'm more than happy to share this land with. Getting to and from my property isn't a simple task. The old logging roads that wind through the forest are rough, rutted affairs that would chew up a typical car in no time. That's why I invested in my trusty Toyota Tacoma. It's an older model, but I've modified it over the years to handle just about anything these backwoods can throw at it. Reinforced suspension, all-terrain tires, and a winch that saved my bacon more than once. It's as much a part of my survival gear as anything else I own. As I climbed into the driver's seat that morning, I had no idea that my reliable old truck was about to become my lifeline in ways I never could have imagined. The first part of my journey was uneventful. The familiar bumps and jolts of the logging road were almost soothing, a rhythmic reminder of the isolation I'd chosen for myself. I was about halfway to the highway when something caught my eye, causing me to ease off the accelerator. There, standing in the middle of the road, maybe 100 yards ahead, was a figure. At first glance, I assumed it was a person, perhaps a hiker who'd gotten turned around or a local who'd wandered too far from one of the distant properties. But as I drew closer, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Something about the figure's proportions seemed off. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, but unnaturally thin. Its posture was all wrong, too, hunched over at an angle that would be painful for a normal human spine to maintain. I slowed the truck to a crawl, squinting through the windshield to try and make out more details. As the distance closed between us, my unease grew into a gnawing dread. This was no lost hiker. Whatever was standing in front of me, it wasn't human. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a sickly gray color, pulled tight over a frame that seemed more bone than muscle. The head was oversized and misshapen, like a grotesque caricature of a human skull. I brought the truck to a stop about 20 feet away from the creature, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I keep stashed next to the driver's seat. Years of military training kicked in, and I found myself assessing the situation with a forced calm that belied the fear coursing through my veins. In all my time living in these woods, I'd encountered my fair share of wildlife. I'd seen bears rummaging through my garden, cougars stalking deer at the edge of the clearing, and even caught a glimpse of a wolverine once. a rare sight in these parts. But this was something entirely different, something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares or horror movies. For what felt like an eternity, the creature remained motionless. I held my breath, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal of my rifle, hoping against hope that this was all some sort of hallucination. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me after all these years. Then, in a movement so sudden it made me flinch, the creature snapped its head towards me. Even through the windshield and the distance between us, I swore I could feel its gaze lock onto mine. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken dark pits that seemed to absorb what little light there was around us. In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, but I remained frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I don't believe in Bigfoot or any of that cryptozoological nonsense. I'm a practical man, grounded in reality. But the thing standing before me defied any rational explanation. What happened next is seared into my memory, a moment of pure terror that I relive in my nightmares to this day. The creature moved, not with the grace of a wild animal or even the awkward gait of a person. It lunged forward with jerky, uneven steps that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its arms, I now saw, hung unnaturally long, almost brushing the ground. At the end of each limb were hands that terminated in wickedly curved claws, but it was the sound that truly chilled me to my core. As it charged towards my truck, the creature let out a screech that no earthly being should be capable of producing. It was a high-pitched, piercing wail that seemed to vibrate through my entire body, setting my teeth on edge and sending shivers down my spine. In that moment, survival instinct finally overcame my paralysis. I threw the Tacoma into reverse and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before finding purchase on the dirt road. As I sped backward, I caught glimpses of the creature in my side mirrors. To my horror, it was gaining on me, covering ground with impossible speed. Panic fueled my every move. I swerved back and forth on the narrow road, trying to make myself a harder target. The truck bounced violently over rocks and roots, threatening to throw me off course with each impact. But I didn't dare slow down, not with that thing in pursuit. I heard a sickening thud as the creature collided with the side of my truck. Metal screeched and tore, and I felt the impact reverberate through the entire vehicle. In the rearview mirror, I saw deep gouges left in the truck's body, a testament to the creature's strength and the lethal nature of its claws. My only coherent thought was to reach the highway. If I could make it there, maybe I'd find other vehicles, other people. Maybe the creature would lose interest if there were easier targets around. It was a desperate hope, but it was all I had to cling to as I careened through the forest. The road twisted and turned through the dense woods, each bend presenting a new challenge. I drove like a man possessed, pushing my old Tacoma to its limits. The engine roared in protest, but I silently urged it on, praying it wouldn't give out on me now. All the while I could hear the creature's screams echoing through the trees. Occasionally I'd catch glimpses of it through the foliage, bounding alongside the road with inhuman speed and agility. Each time I saw it, my heart threatened to burst from my chest. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, I finally broke through the tree line and onto the paved surface of the highway. I didn't slow down, didn't even look back. I just gunned it towards Bend, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. It wasn't until I saw the first signs for the town that I allowed myself to ease off the gas. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide a lurking threat. Every sound made me flinch. I finally pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Bend, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and fear. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, I felt my composure crumble. I sat there in the parking lot for what must have been an hour, trying to calm my racing heart and convince myself that I hadn't completely lost my mind. When I finally felt steady enough to move, I made my way to the station's payphone. My hands trembled as I dialed the number for the local ranger's office. The ranger who answered listened to my story without comment, his silence speaking volumes about how insane I must have sounded. But to his credit, he promised to send someone out to investigate. I knew, even as I hung up the phone, that there was little they could do. Whatever that creature was, it could be miles from my property by now. There would be no trace left for them to find, nothing to corroborate my wild tale. I filed a report with the state troopers as well, but the process felt hollow and useless. The officer taking my statement couldn't quite hide his skepticism, and I couldn't blame him. If our roles were reversed, I'd probably think I was dealing with some backwoods nutcase too. As night fell, I knew I couldn't bring myself to drive back home. The thought of navigating those dark forest roads, of possibly encountering that thing again, was more than I could bear. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, hoping that a hot shower and a soft bed might help me process what had happened. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature charging at my truck. I heard its unearthly screech echoing in my mind. The few times I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with twisted shapes moving through dark woods, always just out of sight but growing ever closer. As I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and jumping at every little noise, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. Something impossible had forced its way into my orderly, rational world, and I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Little did I know this was only the beginning of my nightmare. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. I couldn't bring myself to return to my cabin, instead extending my stay at the motel one night at a time. I told myself I was waiting for news from the rangers or the police, but deep down I knew I was simply avoiding the inevitable confrontation with what had happened. It was on the 4th day after the incident that I received a call from one of the rangers. His name was Mike, and I recognized his voice from our initial conversation. There was a tension in his tone that immediately set me on edge. "We need you to come out to your property," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "I'm sending a couple of deputies to meet you there. They'll escort you up." I wanted to ask questions, to demand some explanation for this sudden urgency, but something in Mike's voice stopped me. Instead, I simply told him I'd be on my way and hung up. The drive back to my turnoff from the highway felt surreal. Every curve in the road, every shadow cast by the towering pines, seemed to hide potential threats. I found myself scanning the tree line constantly, half expecting to see that grotesque figure lurching towards me at any moment. When I reached the start of the logging road that led to my property, I found 2 patrol cars waiting for me. The deputies, a man and a woman, both looked tense. They nodded a greeting but said little as we formed a small convoy and began the ascent to my cabin. The forest felt different now. What had once been a peaceful sanctuary now seemed oppressive and threatening. The dense canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on my eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. As we neared the clearing where my cabin stood, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. On one hand, being back on familiar ground with armed law enforcement present was reassuring. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something dangerous. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. My cabin stood just as I'd left it, its weathered wood blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. The small garden I'd cultivated was undisturbed, and there were no obvious signs of any large animal or anything else having been through the area. The deputies, their hands resting on their holstered weapons, suggested we do a thorough walk around the property. I agreed, gripping my own rifle tightly as we began our inspection. We'd made it about halfway around the cabin when one of the deputies held up a hand signaling us to stop. He pointed towards the creek that ran along the edge of my property, his expression grim. As we approached the creek bed, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a sickly sweet odor of decay, undercut by something else, a musky animal scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There, half hidden by the underbrush, lay the carcass of a deer. But this was no ordinary kill. The animal's body had been savaged, its flesh torn away in ragged strips that spoke of frenzied violence rather than the calculated hunting of a natural predator. What struck me most, however, were the bones. They weren't cleanly stripped as you'd expect from a mountain lion or bear. Instead, they were crushed and splintered, as if something had been trying to extract the marrow within. It was a level of destruction I'd never seen before in all my years in these woods. One of the deputies, the woman, bent down to examine the carcass more closely. I saw her recoil slightly, her hand moving to cover her nose and mouth. When she spoke, her voice was muffled, but filled with a mixture of disgust and fear. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a patch of trampled underbrush next to the deer's remains. We moved closer, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, if you could call it that. It was vaguely human in shape, but massively oversized and distorted. The impression in the soft earth showed what looked like elongated toes, each ending in a deep gouge that could only have been made by some kind of claw. The sight of that footprint brought the memories of my encounter flooding back. I could almost hear that bone-chilling screech echoing through the trees again. My hands began to shake, and I had to take a few deep breaths to steady myself. The deputies exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. I could tell they were struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of the natural world. Part of me wanted to blurt out my story to tell them about the creature I'd seen on the road, but I held back, afraid of how crazy I'd sound. Instead, I watched in silence as they took photos and collected what little physical evidence they could find. They bagged some fur samples found caught on nearby branches and took casts of the footprint. All the while I could sense their unease growing. These were experienced law enforcement officers, used to dealing with the realities of rural crime and wildlife encounters. But this was something entirely different. As we made our way back to the cabin, the female deputy, her name tag read Johnson, pulled me aside. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Mr. Turner, have you noticed anything strange around here lately? Anything out of the ordinary?" I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. "What do you mean by strange?" She glanced at her partner, who was on the radio with someone back at the station, then back to me. "We've had reports." As I recounted the encounter, I could see the disbelief warring with concern on Mike's face. It wasn't until he saw the deep gouges in the wooden floor where the creature had stood, gouges that matched the claw marks we'd found in the forest, that the color drained from his face. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said, eyeing the cuts on my cheek. "Those wounds need to be looked at." I nodded numbly, the reality of what had just happened finally starting to sink in. As we drove to the hospital in Bend, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The creature, the rake, had been in my home. It had stood face to face with me, and somehow I knew this wasn't the end. The next few weeks passed in a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. The cuts on my face healed, leaving behind 3 pale scars that served as a constant reminder of my encounter. The official investigation turned up little. Despite the physical evidence in my cabin, the claw marks, the bullet hole from my shot, there was no trace of the creature itself. No blood, no hair, nothing that could be analyzed. It was as if it had simply vanished into thin air. John Redfeather visited me in the hospital, his weathered face grave as I told him what had happened. "It has chosen you," he said, his voice low. "For whatever reason you have caught its interest. This is not over, my friend, not by a long shot." His words proved prophetic. Though I never again came face to face with the creature, I could feel its presence. Sometimes it was just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a certainty that I was being watched. Other times it was more overt claw marks appearing on trees around my property, strange noises in the night that set my dogs to howling. I tried to go back to my normal life, but how could anything be normal after what I'd experienced? I found myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing every unexplained sound. Sleep became a luxury, snatched in short bursts between bouts of hypervigilance. Ranger Mike and his team did what they could. Patrols were increased, more cameras were installed, but the creature seemed to know exactly how to avoid detection. It was always one step ahead, leaving just enough evidence of its presence to keep us on edge. As the months wore on, a grim realization settled over me. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with guns or cameras. The rake, whatever it was, wasn't just some animal that could be caught or killed. It was something older, something that didn't play by the rules of our world. It was John Redfeather who finally offered a different perspective. "You're thinking about this all wrong," he told me one evening as we sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the forest. "You can't fight this thing with weapons. You need to understand it." "Understand it?" I asked, incredulous. How am I supposed to understand something like that? John smiled, a sad, knowing smile. By accepting it, he said. This creature, it's as much a part of these woods as the trees and the rocks. It was here long before us, and it'll be here long after. Fighting it is like fighting the wind or the rain. You need to learn to coexist. I wanted to argue, to rail against the idea of simply accepting this nightmare as part of my life. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going away. And the more I fought against it, the more it seemed to focus on me. So slowly, painfully, I began to change my approach. Instead of fortifying my home like a fortress, I opened it up. I spent more time outside, even at night. I stopped jumping at every unexplained noise, stopped obsessively checking the security cameras, and gradually things began to change. The signs of the creature's presence became less frequent, less threatening. The claw marks on the trees seemed more like territorial markings than threats. The noises in the night became just another part of the forest's symphony. Don't get me wrong, I never felt completely safe. I knew the creature was still out there, still watching, but it no longer felt like a predator stalking its prey. Instead, it felt more like a neighbor, a dangerous, unpredictable neighbor, but one that was as much a part of this place as I was. Years have passed since that night in my cabin. I still live here in the heart of the Ochoco National Forest. I've thought about leaving, about trying to find somewhere safe, but the truth is, I don't think such a place exists. The world is full of mysteries, full of things that defy our understanding. Running from them doesn't make them go away. So I stay. I tend my garden, I hike the trails, I watch the seasons change, and sometimes on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision, a tall gray figure that watches me with eyes that reflect no light. In those moments, I feel a mixture of fear and something else, a strange sort of kinship. We are both part of this place now, the man and the monster, bound together by a shared secret, a shared understanding of the true nature of these ancient woods. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what the rake is or why it chose to reveal itself to me, but I've made my peace with its existence. In doing so, I've found a deeper connection to this wild, mysterious place I call home. To those who might read this and dismiss it as the ravings of a madman or the plot of a horror story, I say this: there are more things in this world than you can imagine. The line between reality and nightmare is thinner than you think, and sometimes the only way to confront the darkness is to learn to live alongside it. As for me, I'll continue to live here in my cabin, watching the seasons change, listening to the whispers of the forest. And if on some dark night you find yourself driving down a lonely logging road in the Ochoco National Forest, and you see something strange moving in the shadows, well, just remember, you're not alone out there. None of us are. Then, a week after Bill Hawkins disappeared, it happened again. This time it was a couple of hikers, a man and a woman who'd come up from Portland for a weekend camping trip. They'd told friends they were going to hike a popular trail about 10 miles from my cabin. When they didn't return on Sunday night, the authorities were called. I heard about it from Jeb, who stopped by my cabin to warn me. The search and rescue teams had been out for 2 days, he told me, but all they'd found was a trashed campsite. No bodies, no blood, no sign of where the hikers had gone. "It's happening again," Jeb said, his voice barely above a whisper, "just like it did 30 years ago." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression told me he wouldn't say any more. He left soon after, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong in these woods. That night, as I lay in my bunk staring up at the rough-hewn beams of my cabin roof, I heard it for the first time, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started as a low moan, almost too quiet to hear, but it grew louder, rising to a keening wail that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't human, wasn't any animal I knew. It was a sound of hunger, of rage, of something ancient and evil. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, As the sound echoed through the forest, it seemed to go on forever, rising and falling like some hellish tide. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound itself. I strained my ears, listening for what? Footsteps? Breathing? Some indication that whatever had made that ungodly noise was now outside my cabin? But there was nothing. Just the usual night sounds of the forest, as if nothing had happened. As if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that things were about to get much, much worse. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I found myself jumping at every sound, peering into the shadows between the trees, half expecting to see some monstrous shape lurking there. Sleep became a luxury I could ill afford, my nights spent huddled in my cabin, shotgun clutched to my chest, listening for any sound out of the ordinary. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I first saw it. I had just dozed off, exhaustion finally overcoming my fear, when a sound jolted me awake. It was a soft thud, like something heavy landing on the roof of my cabin. For a moment I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement across the roof, as if something large was crawling directly above me. My heart pounding in my chest, I slowly reached for my shotgun. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I eased out of bed, and suddenly the movement on the roof stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, gun raised, waiting. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then I saw it. Through the small window next to my bed, I caught a glimpse of something peering in at me. It was only for a second, but that image would be burned into my mind forever. A face, if you could call it that. Elongated, almost wolf-like, but wrong in a way I couldn't quite define. Its eyes were huge, glowing faintly in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien. But it was the mouth that haunted me, a gaping maw filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. I fired without thinking, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The window exploded outward in a shower of glass and splinters. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. It was a sound of rage, of hunger, and of promise. A promise that this wasn't over. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my cabin, shotgun trained on the shattered window, waiting for the creature to return. But it didn't. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously stepped outside to survey the damage. The area around my cabin looked like a war zone. Deep gouges marred the logs where the creature had climbed, and the ground was torn up as if by massive claws. But it was what I found near the tree line that truly chilled me to the bone. Footprints. But not like any animal I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long razor-sharp claw marks at the end of each toe. And they were bipedal. Whatever had made these tracks walked on two legs. As I stood there staring at those alien footprints, the full weight of my situation crashed down upon me. This wasn't some bear or wolf or any other normal predator. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Whatever this thing was, it knew where I was now. It would be back, and next time a shotgun might not be enough to save me. With shaking hands, I began to pack my meager belongings. I had to get out of these woods, had to warn someone about what was out here. But as I was shoving the last of my supplies into my backpack, a thought stopped me cold. Jeb. The old man was still out here somewhere, along with who knew how many other unsuspecting people. I couldn't just leave them to face this thing alone. With a heavy heart, I unpacked my bag. I knew it was probably suicide to stay, but I couldn't live with myself if I just ran away. I had to find Jeb, had to warn him and anyone else I could find. As I stepped out of my cabin, shotgun in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Somewhere out there in the deep shadows of the forest, the creature was waiting, and I had a sinking feeling that our next encounter would be our last. The forest, once a place of solace and freedom for me, had become a nightmare landscape. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every snapping twig a harbinger of the horror that now stalked these woods. But I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I had to find Jeb, had to warn him about what was out here. I started by heading towards where I'd last seen the old man, near his trap line. The journey, which would normally have taken me a couple of hours, stretched on interminably. Every few steps I found myself spinning around, sure that I'd heard something moving in the underbrush behind me. It was nearing midday when I finally reached Jeb's usual hunting grounds. The area was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of forest life. It was as if the very animals themselves were hiding, aware of the predator that now roamed these woods. "Jeb!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "Jeb, are you out here?" There was no response, just the whisper of wind through the trees. I was about to call out again when I saw it, a flash of color against the brown and green of the forest floor. My heart in my throat, I moved closer. It was Jeb's hat, the old red cap he always wore. It lay on the ground, partially hidden by fallen leaves, and next to it, I fell to my knees, my stomach heaving. There on the forest floor was a scene of carnage that defied description. What was left of Jeb lay scattered across the clearing, as if something had torn him apart with inhuman strength and ferocity. As I knelt there, struggling to come to terms with what I was seeing, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, shotgun raised, but there was nothing there. Just the endless trees and the growing certainty that I was being watched. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whatever had done this to Jeb might still be nearby, and I had no desire to share his fate. With a final, regretful look at the old man's remains, I turned and began to make my way back to my cabin. The journey back was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. By the time I reached my clearing, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. I barricaded myself inside, pushing my crude furniture against the door and windows. As darkness fell, the sounds began, scratching at the walls, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, and that same unearthly howl I'd heard before. It went on for hours, a psychological torture that had me on the verge of breakdown. When dawn finally broke, I was huddled in the corner, shotgun clutched to my chest, eyes wild from lack of sleep. The sounds had stopped, but I knew the reprieve was only temporary. Whatever was out there, it was playing with me, wearing me down. I knew then that I couldn't stay. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to just go away. It was hunting me, and sooner or later it would find a way in. My only hope was to make a run for it, to try and reach civilization before it caught up with me. I spent the morning gathering supplies, packing only what was absolutely necessary: food, water, my shotgun, and all the ammunition I had. As I worked, I tried to formulate a plan. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, a journey that would normally take me a day and a half of hard hiking. But that was under normal circumstances, not while being hunted by some ungodly creature. As the sun reached its zenith, I took one last look around my cabin. For a brief time it had been home, a sanctuary from the world. Now it felt like a tomb. With a heavy heart, I shouldered my pack and stepped out into the forest. I struck out east, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The woods were unnaturally silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I heard it, a crash in the underbrush behind me, followed by that now familiar growl. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, moving through the forest with inhuman speed. The sound of its pursuit drove me on, past exhaustion, past fear, to a place of pure animal survival. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, but eventually I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame rusted but still standing. Without thinking, I made for it, scrambling up the stairs as fast as my trembling legs would carry me. I had just reached the top when I heard it enter the clearing. For the first time I got a clear look at my pursuer, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. Its fur was matted and patchy, revealing grayish skin underneath, but it was the face that truly horrified me, elongated, with a protruding snout filled with razor-sharp teeth and eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed with an unholy intelligence, filled with hunger and hate. For a moment we stared at each other. Then it charged the tower. The whole structure shook as it began to climb, the metal groaning under its weight. I raised my shotgun, knowing that if I missed, it would be the end. The boom of the shotgun echoed through the clearing. The creature roared in pain and rage, losing its grip and falling to the ground. But even as I watched, the wound I'd inflicted began to close. It circled the base of the tower, growling and snapping, looking for a way up. I knew the respite was only temporary. Sooner or later it would find a way to reach me, or I'd have to come down. Either way, I was trapped. As night fell, I huddled in the cramped confines of the fire tower, listening to the creature's movements below. The cold bit through my clothes and hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I didn't dare sleep. I knew that the moment I closed my eyes might be my last. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The creature circled endlessly, occasionally throwing itself at the tower's supports, making the whole structure shudder. Each time, I was certain the aged metal would give way, sending me plummeting into its waiting jaws. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. My thoughts became muddled, reality blurring at the edges. In my delirium, I began to hallucinate, seeing shapes moving in the darkness beyond the creature. Were there more of them out there, or was my mind finally snapping under the strain? It was in those dark hours before dawn that I had my epiphany. This thing, this monster, it wasn't just some animal. The intelligence in its eyes, the way it had stalked me, played with me. This was something older, something that didn't belong in our world. I remembered the stories I'd heard as a child, tales of skinwalkers and wendigos, creatures that straddled the line between man and beast. Was that what this was? Some ancient evil woken from its slumber by our encroachment into its territory? Or was it something even worse, something our ancestors had known and feared, but that we, in our modern arrogance, had forgotten? As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made my decision. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. One way or another, this had to end. With trembling hands, I checked my shotgun. I had 2 shells left. It would have to be enough. I waited until the creature circled to the far side of the tower, then began my descent. Each step down the metal ladder felt like a step closer to my doom, but I forced myself to continue. My feet had barely touched the ground when I heard it. The rush of movement, the snarl of triumph. I spun around, raising the shotgun just as the creature burst from the underbrush. Time seemed to slow. I saw every detail with crystal clarity. The saliva dripping from its jaws, the mad gleam in its eyes, the muscles bunching as it leaped towards me. I fired, the recoil nearly knocking me off my feet. The blast caught the creature in mid-leap, sending it crashing to the ground. But even as it fell, I could see the wound beginning to close. I had 1 shell left, and I knew it wouldn't be enough. As the creature struggled to its feet, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran, not away but towards it. It was so surprised by my action that it hesitated for a split second. That was all I needed. I jammed the barrel of the shotgun into its mouth and pulled the trigger. The explosion threw me backward. For a moment, all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing. As my vision cleared, I saw the creature lying motionless on the ground, most of its head gone. I waited, shotgun raised, for what felt like hours. But the creature didn't move. Slowly, cautiously, I approached. It was dead. Really, truly dead. As the adrenaline faded, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I wanted nothing more than to collapse right there, to sleep for a week. But I knew I couldn't. There might be more of these things out there, and I had to warn someone. With a final look at the creature's corpse, I turned and began the long walk towards civilization. I didn't know if anyone would believe my story, but I had to try. Because if there were more of these things out there, God help us all. It's been years since that day in the woods, but the memories haunt me still. I dream of it sometimes, the chase, the tower, the final confrontation. I wake up screaming, the phantom smell of wet fur and rotting meat in my nostrils. The authorities didn't believe me, of course. They found the remains of Jeb and the missing hikers, attributing their deaths to a bear attack. The creature's body had disappeared by the time I led them back to the clearing, leaving behind only a dark stain on the forest floor. I tried to move on, to forget. I left Maine, drifted south, took whatever jobs I could find, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that howl again, distant but unmistakable. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that there are more of them out there. So I keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. I sleep with a loaded gun under my pillow and jump at every shadow. Some might call it paranoia. I call it survival. Because I've seen what lurks in the dark places of the world. I've looked into the eyes of a nightmare and lived to tell the tale. And I know that someday, somehow, I'll have to face it again. Until then, I'll keep running, and I'll never go into the deep woods again. August 21st, 1999. That was the day I decided I'd had enough. Enough of the relentless pace of city life, the constant cacophony of car horns and sirens, the feeling of suffocation that came with being surrounded by millions of people, yet feeling utterly alone. I was just another nameless face in the crowd, another cog in the vast, uncaring machine of urban existence. My name's Wyatt, and I guess you could say I was running away. Not from the law or anything like that, but from a life that had lost its meaning. I'd served my country as an Army Ranger, seen things that no man should see, done things that still haunt my dreams. When I got out, I thought I could just slip back into civilian life, but it wasn't that easy. The city felt alien to me now, its rhythms and routines as foreign as any far-flung country I'd been deployed to. So I ran. Found myself a piece of land tucked away in the Ozarks, far from the nearest town. It wasn't much, just a few acres of dense forest with a small clearing near a bubbling creek. But it was mine, and it was quiet. I spent that first summer building my cabin with my own 2 hands. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy, just a simple one-room affair with a loft for sleeping. But it was more of a home than any place I'd lived since leaving for basic training all those years ago. Life out there was different. Harder in some ways, easier in others. My days fell into a simple routine, chopping wood, hunting, fishing, tending to my small vegetable garden. I let my beard grow wild and my hair long. If you saw me out there in my faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, axe in hand, you'd never guess I was once a highly trained soldier. And that suited me just fine. That first year passed in a blur of seasons. I watched the forest transform from the lush green of summer to the fiery hues of autumn, then the stark beauty of winter, and finally the rebirth of spring. I learned the rhythms of the woods, the calls of the birds, the habits of the deer and turkey I hunted for food. For the first time in years I felt at peace. But peace, as I'd learned the hard way, is often fleeting. It started with whispers. Rumors that drifted in whenever I made my monthly trip into town for supplies. People were disappearing. At first it was easy to dismiss. The Ozarks are vast and largely untamed. It wasn't uncommon for inexperienced hikers to get lost, though they were usually found within a day or two, shaken but alive. But these disappearances were different. The first to go was old Ezra, a grizzled trapper who lived even deeper in the hills than I did. He was a loner, kept to himself mostly, but he'd stop by my cabin every now and then to trade pelts for some of my home-brewed moonshine. Didn't think much of it when he didn't show up for a while. Figured he was just on an extended trapping run. But then word came that someone had checked his cabin. It was abandoned, no sign of Ezra, no indication of where he might have gone. His rifle was still there, propped up by the door. Ezra would no sooner leave without his gun than without his own arm. Then it was a young couple, tourists from the city out for a weekend hike on one of the popular trails. They never made it back to their car. Search parties combed the area for days, but found nothing. Not a backpack, not a scrap of clothing, not even a footprint. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. The locals started talking. Some blamed it on the wild hogs that roamed the forests, saying they were getting bolder, more aggressive. Others whispered about mountain lions, maybe one that had developed a taste for human flesh. I tried to brush it off, told myself they were just stories. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a cold, damp fog. Something wasn't right in these woods. The disappearances felt wrong, too clean, too calculated. Wild animals leave traces, blood, torn clothing, tracks, but there was nothing. It was as if whatever was taking these people was smart enough to cover its tracks. I started taking precautions, secured my cabin better, reinforced the door and windows, kept my rifle loaded at all times, even when I was just sitting on my porch watching the sunset. I'd served in some of the most dangerous places on earth, faced down enemies who wanted nothing more than to kill me. But something about this unseen threat in the woods I'd come to call home chilled me to my core. Nights were the worst. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, would sometimes go deathly still. In those moments of unnatural silence, I'd swear I could hear something moving out there in the darkness. Ragged breathing, the snap of a twig under a heavy foot, the rustle of leaves as something large passed by. I told myself it was just my imagination, my combat-honed instincts on overdrive. But deep down I knew. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and sooner or later it would come for me. I just never expected it to happen quite the way it did. It was a night in late October. The air had turned crisp, carrying the first hints of the winter to come. A full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, bathing the clearing around my cabin in an eerie silver glow. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of chopping wood to prepare for the cold months ahead. I'm not sure what woke me. Some sixth sense, maybe, honed by years in combat zones where a moment's inattention could mean death. One second I was asleep, the next I was bolt upright in bed, every nerve in my body screaming that something was wrong. Then I heard it. A sound like branches snapping, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. Footsteps, heavy ones moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the rough wooden floor. My rifle was propped in the corner, and I grabbed it, the familiar weight offering little comfort against the nameless dread that filled me. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the window. For a long moment I saw nothing but the moonlit clearing, shadows stretching long and dark from the surrounding trees. Then something moved at the tree line. God help me, I'll never forget the sight of it as long as I live. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. In the silvery moonlight I could make out matted fur covering its body, dark and coarse. But it wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd ever seen before in all my time in these woods. Its head was the worst part, wolf-like, but twisted, wrong somehow. The muzzle was stretched out too long, filled with teeth that gleamed wickedly in the moonlight. And its eyes, Christ, those eyes, they burned with a hungry yellow light, filled with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. This was no animal, at least not any kind of animal I'd ever known. For a moment we just stared at each other, me frozen in terror behind my cabin window, it hunched at the edge of the clearing, those terrible eyes fixed on my home, on me. Then it moved. I've seen men move fast in combat, seen predators strike in the wild, but nothing could have prepared me for the speed at which this thing charged. One second it was at the tree line, the next it was halfway across the clearing, covering the distance in a few impossible bounds. Instinct took over. I raised my rifle and fired, the shot deafeningly loud in the quiet night. I saw the thing stumble, heard it snarl, a bone-chilling sound that was neither human nor animal, but it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to get angry. It hit my cabin door like a freight train. The sturdy oak, which had weathered years of Ozark storms, splintered under the impact. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the back window, shouldering it open and tumbling out into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard the creature smash its way into my home, heard the crunch of furniture being tossed aside like kindling. I ran. I'd like to say I had some plan, some destination in mind. But the truth is, I just ran. Blind panic drove me deeper into the woods, branches whipping at my face, rocks and roots threatening to trip me with every stride. All the while, I could hear it behind me, the crash of its pursuit through the underbrush, its ragged snarls echoing through the trees. Sometimes it seemed right on my heels, other times it faded, only to surge closer again moments later. It was toying with me, I realized, like a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. I lost all track of time. It could have been minutes or hours that I ran through those dark woods, my lungs burning, my legs leaden. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, When I was sure those savage jaws were about to close on my neck, I burst out of the tree line. A logging road, and there, like some impossible miracle, a truck. Its headlights cut through the gloom, momentarily blinding me. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted for the vehicle, waving my arms wildly, shouting incoherently. The truck slowed, and I all but threw myself into the passenger side. "Drive!" I gasped, not even looking at the driver. "For the love of God, drive!" To his credit, the driver didn't ask questions. He stomped on the gas, the truck's engine roaring as we sped down the rough dirt road. Only then did I dare to look back. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dark smudge of the forest we'd left behind. Then, just for an instant, I caught a glimpse of something at the tree line. A hulking shape, those burning yellow eyes fixed on the retreating truck. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. The driver, a grizzled old logger by the looks of him, gave me a long, suspicious look. Can't say I blamed him. There I was, wild-eyed and panting, dressed only in a t-shirt and boxers, with scratches all over my arms and face from my mad dash through the woods. "The hell happened to you, boy?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I opened my mouth, closed it again. What could I say? That I'd been chased through the woods by some impossible monster? That the stuff of campfire stories and bad horror movies had just tried to eat me? "Bear," I managed finally. "Rogue bear. Broke into my cabin." He grunted, clearly not buying it but not pressing the issue either. "Where to?" "Nearest town," I said. Just get me to people." He nodded, and we drove in silence. I kept looking back, half expecting to see that thing loping after us down the road, but there was nothing but darkness. We reached the town just as dawn was breaking. The logger dropped me off in front of the sheriff's office without a word. I thanked him, my voice hoarse, and watched as he drove away, no doubt with one hell of a story to tell his buddies. I reported the attack to the sheriff, sticking to my story about a rogue bear. He didn't believe me. That much was clear from the look in his eyes. But what could he do? There was no crime to investigate, no missing person report to file, just the ramblings of a wild-eyed man in his underwear. I didn't stick around to see what, if anything, they'd do. As soon as the sheriff was done taking my statement, I was gone. Hitchhiked to the next town over, used the emergency cash I kept in a hidden pocket of my wallet to buy some clothes and a bus ticket to anywhere but there. I've never set foot in those woods again. That was 5 years ago. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, other times like it was just yesterday. I drift now, moving from one cheap motel to the next, never staying in one place for too long. Always on the edge of town where I can keep an eye on the tree line, where the vastness of the wilderness doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. I've tried to convince myself that it was all a dream, some vivid hallucination brought on by too much solitude, too much time alone with my thoughts. But I know better. The nightmares won't let me forget. In my dreams, I'm back in those woods, always running, always with that thing right behind me. Sometimes I'm back in my cabin watching as it tears through the door like it's made of paper. Those eyes, those goddamn yellow eyes, they haunt me. I wake up in cold sweats, the sheets tangled around me, the phantom stench of wet fur and rotting meat in my nostrils. I've done research trying to make sense of what happened to me. I found stories, legends really, from all over the country. The Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin, the Dogmen of Michigan, the Fook Monster in Arkansas. Different names, different descriptions, but always with a common thread. Something not quite wolf, not quite bear, but infinitely more terrifying than either. Some call the thing I saw the Ozark Howler. Others have older names for it, names in languages I can't pronounce. I don't know what it is, not really. Some cryptid that science hasn't discovered, some evolutionary offshoot, a holdover from a time when megafauna roamed the continent, or something older, something that doesn't fit into our neat categories of animal and monster. I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that I'll never feel truly safe again. I catch glimpses sometimes, even now, a hulking shape disappearing around a corner just as I turn my head, a flash of yellow eyes in a darkened alley, the sound of heavy breathing and footsteps when I'm walking alone at night. Is it real? Am I seeing things? Or has that encounter in the woods broken something in my mind, left me jumping at shadows for the rest of my life? I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever know. What I do know is this. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the shadows, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I ran from one of those things, but I don't think I'll ever truly escape it. Maybe one day it'll corner me. Maybe then I'll find out what it really is, what drives it, what it wants. But I hope that day never comes. For now, I'll keep moving, keep watching the tree line, and hope that whatever is out there, whatever chased me through those moonlit woods on that October night, stays in the wilderness where it belongs. But deep down, I know better. You can't run forever, and some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The city doesn't seem so bad anymore. At least here the monsters wear human faces. They're predictable, understandable. But out there in the vast, lonely places of the world, there are older things, terrible things, things that are still hungry, and they're patient, oh so patient. They can wait. And someday when I let my guard down, when I think I'm finally safe, they'll be waiting for me, in the shadows, in the silence between heartbeats, waiting. My name's Caleb, and on July 22nd, 1997, a Tuesday, my life changed forever. But let me back up a bit. I've lived out here in the Olympic National Forest for 8 years now. It wasn't always this way. I used to work construction, had a wife named Anna, the whole 9 yards. We lived in Seattle, caught up in the rat race like everyone else. I thought I was happy, or at least content, but there was always this nagging feeling, a restlessness I couldn't shake. It all came to a head when Anna and I lost our baby. She was only 5 months pregnant, but we'd already picked out names, started decorating the nursery. The miscarriage hit us both hard. Anna threw herself into her work, staying late at the office, barely speaking when she was home. I started drinking, missing shifts, picking fights with coworkers. We were like two ships passing in the night, both drowning in our own grief. One day I came home to find Anna gone. There was a note on the kitchen table saying she needed time, that she couldn't bear to be in the house anymore. I sat there staring at that piece of paper for hours, a half-empty bottle of whiskey my only company. The next morning I made a decision. I packed up my truck with camping gear, some tools, and whatever food I could find in the pantry. I left a note for Anna telling her I loved her, but that I needed to find myself again. Then I drove. I didn't have a destination in mind, just followed the roads out of the city, watching the urban sprawl give way to forests and mountains. I ended up here, in the heart of the Olympic National Forest. There was something about this place that called to me. The towering trees, the mist-shrouded valleys, the sense of ancient primordial wilderness. I found an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, probably an old hunter's shelter or Forest Service outpost. It was run down but solid. I decided to stay just for a while to clear my head. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I fixed up the cabin, learned to hunt and trap, started a small garden. The solitude that I thought would drive me mad became a comfort. The forest, with all its dangers and beauty, became my home. This, I realized, was living. Don't get me wrong, it's work, but it's my work, peaceful. Well, usually peaceful. The days bleed together sometimes, what with the routine. Up at dawn, check the traps, tend the garden, chop wood. It's a good system. Keeps me busy, keeps me fed. I make trips into town every few months for supplies I can't make or scavenge. The locals think I'm odd, the hermit in the woods, but they're friendly enough. Some even seek me out for fresh game or wild herbs. I thought I'd found my place in the world, a life that made sense to me. But that Tuesday in July showed me how wrong I was, how unprepared I was for the true dangers lurking in these ancient forests. The day started like any other. I woke with the sun, made a quick breakfast of oatmeal and dried berries, and headed out to check my traps. The morning was cool, mist still clinging to the ground in places. The familiar sounds of the forest surrounded me, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant gurgle of a stream. I was heading back to the cabin, a couple of rabbits slung over my shoulder, when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer carcass, all sprawled out weird in a small clearing. It wasn't uncommon to find animal remains out here. I figured maybe a cougar got to it, but as I got closer, something felt off. The shape was wrong for a deer, and there was this smell. God, the smell hit me like a physical force. It wasn't right, not like anything I'd come across out here before. It was a sickly sweet odor, mixed with the coppery tang of blood and something else, something that made my stomach churn. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt. Closer still, and I realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was a man. No, not just any man. It was Jenkins. Old Ben Jenkins, the hermit that lived a few miles east of my cabin. Now, I wasn't what you'd call friends with Ben. He was a grumpy old coot, kept to himself even more than I did. But I'd seen him in town once or twice, traded supplies with him on occasion. Finding him like this, well, it rattled me to my core. Ben was torn up bad, and I mean bad. This wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen, and I'd seen my fair share out here. There was no fur around the body, not like a predator had gotten to him. His skin was peeled in places like someone had taken a knife and just started flaying him. His clothes were in tatters, barely clinging to his mangled body. But it was his face that haunted me the most. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, the whites yellowed and bloodshot. I'd never seen a man look so terrified, even in death. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, teeth bared in a grotesque rictus. The sight of Ben's body, the overpowering stench, the sheer wrongness of it all. It took every ounce of willpower I had not to turn tail and run. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and cold sweat trickled down my back despite the cool morning air. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to flee, to pretend I'd never stumbled across this nightmarish scene, but I knew I couldn't do that. I owed it to Ben, cantankerous as he was, to figure out who or what did this to him. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded thin and weak in the oppressive silence that had fallen over the clearing. There was no answer, not even an echo. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to approach Ben's body, fighting back waves of nausea. Up close, the damage was even worse. Whatever had done this hadn't just killed him. It had torn him apart with a savage fury I couldn't comprehend. I knelt beside him, looking for, I don't know what, some clue, some sign that would make sense of this horror. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first I thought I was seeing things, my mind playing tricks on me in the face of this gruesome discovery. But no, they were there, pressed into the soft earth around Ben's body. They were big, too big for a bear or anything normal out here. And the shape? All wrong. They didn't have claws, more like fingers, only longer. Much longer. I've been a hunter most of my life. I know animal tracks. I can tell you if a deer passed through an area 3 days ago just by looking at the ground. But these weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. They were almost human but distorted, like a child's drawing of a hand come to life and pressed into the dirt. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear attack gone wrong? Some new predator that had wandered into the area? Or something worse, something I didn't want to put a name to? I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked around the clearing. The tracks led off into the woods, meandering in a way that seemed almost purposeful, like whatever made them was searching for something, or someone. I gripped my rifle tight, my knuckles white against the worn wood of the stock. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back to the safety of my cabin and radio for help. But I couldn't, not yet. I had to know what did this. I had to make sure it wouldn't happen to anyone else. With one last look at Ben's mutilated body, I set off into the woods, following those impossible tracks. My heart was pounding, sweat rolling down my face despite the cool morning air. I knew I wasn't tracking a deer anymore. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, and I was walking right into its territory. The forest, once so familiar to me, now felt alien and threatening. The very air seemed to have changed, growing heavy and oppressive, like the atmosphere before a massive storm. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the skittering of small animals, had all but disappeared. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pressed forward, following the bizarre tracks deeper into the wilderness. They zigzagged erratically, sometimes doubling back on themselves, other times spreading out as if whatever made them was searching for something, or someone. The thought sent a chill down my spine. My rifle was a comforting weight in my hands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might be useless against whatever had done that to Ben. Still, I gripped it tightly, my index finger resting just outside the trigger guard, ready to snap into action at a moment's notice. As I moved deeper into the forest, the terrain became more rugged. The well-worn trails I was familiar with gave way to dense underbrush and fallen logs. The canopy above grew thicker, filtering out more and more sunlight until I was walking in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, damper, clinging to my skin like a film. I lost track of time as I followed the trail. It could have been minutes or hours. The forest had become a maze, each tree looking like the last, each shadow potentially hiding some unspeakable horror. More than once, I considered turning back, returning to the relative safety of my cabin. But the image of Ben's mutilated body kept me going. I had to know what did this. I had to stop it if I could. The knot in my stomach grew tighter with each step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I spun around more than once, rifle raised, only to find nothing but the endless trees staring back at me. The tracks led me to a small creek, its waters running dark and swift over moss-covered rocks. Here, the signs of violence were even more pronounced. The banks of the creek were torn up, great gouges ripped into the earth as if by massive claws. And there, caught in the gnarled roots of an old cedar, I saw more of what Ben had become. Bits and pieces strewn about like some monstrous child had gotten bored with a toy. An arm here, part of a leg there, all in various states of decay. The water ran red in places, and the stench was overwhelming. I almost lost my lunch right then and there, doubling over and dry heaving as the full horror of what I was seeing hit me. As I stood there trying to regain my composure, a branch snapped behind me. I spun around, rifle raised, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But there was nothing there, nothing but the dense trees and encroaching shadows. Panic surged through me. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting between the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Crouched on a massive boulder, partially hidden by the gloom, was the biggest, ugliest thing I'd ever laid eyes on. It was tall as a man, maybe taller, with a hunched, powerful frame that spoke of immense strength. Its skin was like raw, mottled leather, hanging in loose folds in some places and stretched tight over bulging muscles in others. Its head was too big for its body, with a jaw that hung slack, revealing a tangle of teeth like broken glass. But it was its eyes that truly terrified me. They were huge, yellow, and slitted like a snake's, and they were focused right on me. Those eyes held an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. This wasn't some dumb animal. This thing, whatever it was thinking, planning. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the slight fog it made in the chill air. The creature didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It just watched me with those terrible eyes. Then it let out a low growl that made the ground tremble. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part animal, part something else entirely. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. I fired a warning shot, the crack of the rifle impossibly loud in the silent forest. But the creature didn't flinch. If anything, it seemed amused by my pitiful display of defiance. We stared at each other, time itself frozen. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at death itself. This thing, this monster, had killed Ben, and now it had found its next victim. Then with a speed that belied its size, it lunged. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. Behind me I could hear the creature giving chase, its powerful strides eating up the distance between us. I didn't stop running until I fell into my cabin and bolted the door. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. Outside I could hear something moving around, circling the cabin, but it didn't attack. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away. I never went back to that clearing. Hell, I don't go deep into the woods anymore. Whatever that thing was, it owns that territory now. I hear it at night sometimes, a guttural howl that sends chills down my spine. Some folks in town think I went mad seeing Ben like that. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw. They call it Bigfoot and other fancy names. Me, I just call it the Ripper. And I know it's still out there, waiting. Word of Ben's death spread through town like wildfire. It was the kind of news that shattered the illusion of safety we'd all built up living on the edge of the wilderness. Suddenly the forest that had been our backyard, our playground, our livelihood, became something dark and threatening. The sheriff, a burly man named Frank Garrett, chalked it up to a bear attack. "Nasty business," he said, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. "But that's the risk you take, living out here all alone." He gave me a look when he said that, part pity, part suspicion. I knew what he was thinking. Two hermits out in the woods, one ends up dead. It didn't take a genius to connect those dots, but I knew the truth. What I'd seen out there wasn't any bear. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I tried to tell them, to warn them, but the words caught in my throat. How could I describe that thing without sounding like a madman? So I kept quiet, let them believe what they wanted to believe. The town buzzed with rumors and speculation. Some folks whispered about drug cartels using the remote wilderness for their operations. Others talked about escaped convicts or some new breed of predator driven down from the mountains by climate change. They looked at me, the crazy hermit, the only one who'd seen the scene. They asked questions I couldn't answer, not without sounding even crazier than they already thought I was. Summer turned to fall and the woods blazed with color. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. But now, every red leaf reminded me of blood. Every shadow held the potential for horror. I tried to stick to my routine, tried to pretend that thing wasn't out there. But the fear gnawed at me day and night. Every rustle of leaves became a predator on the prowl. Every snapping twig was that monster, coming back to finish what it started. I started sleeping with a shotgun instead of a pillow. My nights filled with fitful dreams of yellow eyes and teeth like broken glass. Then came the noises. At first I thought I was imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me in the endless solitude, but soon there was no denying it. Scraping sounds outside the cabin at night, too deliberate to be a curious animal. Howls in the darkness closer than before, circling my home like a wolf circles its prey. They were toying with me. I knew it. Each dawn I'd step outside, shotgun in hand, and find tracks circling my home. Sometimes they were those same impossible prints I'd seen by Ben's body. Other times they were different. Cloven hooves, bird-like talons, things I couldn't even begin to describe. It was as if the creature was mocking me, showing me all the shapes it could take. My traps started coming up empty. Not sprung, mind you, but raided. The bait would be gone, and those damn tracks would lead away into the trees. This wasn't just hunting anymore. This was intelligent. It wanted to starve me out, to weaken me until I was easy prey. I started rationing my food, stretching out my supplies as long as I could. But I knew I was fighting a losing battle. Sooner or later, I'd have to leave the relative safety of my cabin and make a run for town. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my bones, that's exactly what it was waiting for. The breaking point came on a crisp November morning. I'd been holed up in the cabin for days, too terrified to venture out even to check my snares. My supplies were running dangerously low, and I knew I had to do something. I stepped outside, shotgun at the ready, and made my way to the nearest trap line. Empty. All of them. Not just empty, but destroyed. The snares had been torn apart, the ground around them churned up as if by a miniature tornado, and there, pressed into a patch of mud, was a single, massive footprint. A message clear as day. "You're next." That's when I made the plan. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it was the only thing I could think of. I wasn't going to wait around to become that thing's next meal. I was going to take the fight to it. I spent the day preparing. I packed what little food I had left, my shotgun, and as much ammo as I could carry. I doused the cabin in kerosene, my hands shaking as I splashed the flammable liquid over the rough-hewn logs. This place had been my home for 8 years, but now it was just a cage, a trap waiting to spring shut. As the sun began to set, I took one last look around the cabin. So many memories here, good and bad. For a moment, I thought about Anna, wondered if she ever tried to find me. But that was a lifetime ago. A different man. I shook off the thoughts and steeled myself for what was to come. I waited until full dark, the moon hanging heavy in the sky and casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Then, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, I struck a match and set fire to my home. The flames caught quickly, racing up the kerosene-soaked walls. Within minutes, the entire cabin was engulfed, a massive bonfire lighting up the night. The heat was intense, driving back the autumn chill and casting flickering shadows through the trees. And there it was, the Ripper silhouetted against the fire, its eyes gleaming like hot coals in the darkness. It was even more terrifying than I remembered, massive, misshapen, a nightmare given flesh. It threw back its head and roared, a sound of fury and frustration that shook the very ground. That was my cue. I ran, not away from it but deeper into the woods, following a trail I'd memorized over the past few days. My plan was simple, born of desperation and a lifetime of living in these forests. I was going to lead it towards town. If the creature was what I thought it was, it craved isolation, the lights, the noise, the multitude of people. I hoped it would be driven back. I ran for my life, branches tearing at my clothes, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I could hear the Ripper crashing through the underbrush behind me, its howls echoing through the night. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time, but it was drawing out the chase, savoring my fear. I stumbled, my foot catching on an exposed root, and went down hard. I scrambled to my feet just as the Ripper burst through a thicket. Moonlight gleamed off its teeth as it lunged, and I felt its monstrous hand rip through my jacket, claws raking across my back. The pain was immediate and intense, like being branded with white-hot iron, but the adrenaline surging through my system pushed it to the background. I had lost my shotgun in the fall, but I still had my knife. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all I had left. I gripped the blade and turned in one fluid movement, slashing out as the Ripper hurtled past. A scream, not mine, ripped through the night. I had hit something. I felt warm liquid splatter across my face, smelled the coppery tang of blood mixed with something foul and alien. Then the Ripper was gone, vanished back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I lay there panting, my heart pounding against my ribs. Had it worked? Had I actually managed to hurt the thing? Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. The stench of blood hung heavy in the air, an acrid, unfamiliar smell that made my eyes water. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on with shaking hands. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a crimson trail leading further into the trees. My gambit had failed. The thing was injured, yes, but still very much alive. And now it was angry. With a heavy heart, I turned and stumbled towards the lights of town, knowing that I had unleashed something terrible upon the world. The sleepy town nestled in the shadow of Olympic National Forest hasn't been so sleepy since that night. There have been more disappearances, more gruesome remains found on the fringes of the woods. The authorities blame it on bears, cougars, even those rumored drug cartels. But I know the truth. That creature, the Ripper, it's still out there. Wounded, angry, and likely biding its time. It's become more cautious since our encounter, rarely venturing close to town. But every so often a hiker goes missing, or a hunter fails to return. And each time I know it's the Ripper, growing bolder, more vengeful. I live in a cheap motel room now, unable to return to the forest that was once my home. I'm always looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. They think I'm the crazy one, the hermit who lost his mind and burned down his own cabin. But I'm still alive. Can't say the same for the folks who didn't heed my warnings, who ventured too deep into the Ripper's domain. Some nights, when the wind is right, I hear those howls carried on the breeze. A reminder that it hasn't forgotten me, that our battle isn't over. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. But this time, I'll be ready. I've spent the past months researching, reaching out to others who've had similar encounters. There are more of us than you'd think. People who've seen things that defy explanation, who've faced horrors in the dark places of the world. We share information, theories, strategies for survival. I'm not the same man I was when I first came to these woods, seeking solitude and a simpler life. I've been changed by what I've seen, by what I've endured. The naive belief that I could escape the complexities of the world by retreating into nature has been shattered. There are things out there, ancient and terrible things that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. The Ripper is just one of them, and as long as it's out there, as long as it poses a threat to innocent lives, I can't rest. I won't rest. So I prepare, I train, I gather allies and resources, because I know that someday, somehow, I'll face the Ripper again, and when that day comes, only one of us will walk away. To those who might read this account, take it as a warning. The world is vaster and more terrifying than you can imagine. The dark places still hold secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth. Be careful where you tread, and always, always trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and every fiber of your being screams at you to run, listen, because next time it might be you stumbling upon something that should not be. And unlike me, you might not live to tell the tale. As I sit here penning these words in my dingy motel room, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought me here. From a disillusioned construction worker to a hermit in the woods, to a man haunted by an encounter with something beyond comprehension. It's been a strange and terrifying road. I often wonder about Anna, the wife I left behind all those years ago. Does she ever think of me? Did she try to find me after I disappeared into the wilderness? Part of me hopes she's moved on, found happiness somewhere far from here. Another part aches to see her again, to apologize for leaving, to warn her about the dangers lurking in the shadows. But I know that's impossible now. The man she knew is gone, replaced by someone or something else. The forest changed me, and my encounter with the Ripper completed that transformation. I'm no longer Caleb the hermit or Caleb the husband. I'm something new, forged in terror and determination. Tomorrow I'll leave this town. There have been reports of similar creatures in other remote areas, and I intend to investigate. Perhaps by understanding these beings, by tracking them and studying them, I can find a way to stop them, or at least warn others of the danger. It's a lonely path I've chosen, full of danger and uncertainty, but it's the only way I can make sense of what happened to me, what happened to Ben, and all the others who've fallen victim to these unknown horrors. To anyone reading this, stay vigilant. The world is not what you think it is. There are monsters out there wearing many faces. Some look like men, others like beasts, and some defy description entirely. But they're real, and they're hungry, and they're always watching from the shadows. As for me, I'll keep fighting, keep searching, because I know the Ripper is out there waiting, and someday we'll meet again. When that day comes, I intend to be ready. This is Caleb signing off. If you're reading this, consider yourself warned, and may God have mercy on us all. I was never one for cabins. My friends used to tease me about it, saying I was too much of a city guy, always surrounded by concrete and noise. They weren't entirely wrong. I'd grown up in Detroit, where the constant hum of traffic and the flickering glow of streetlights were as familiar to me as the back of my hand. The idea of spending time in some remote woodland retreat, far from the comforts of urban life, had always seemed more like punishment than relaxation. But after years of long shifts as an EMT, dealing with the chaos of emergencies and never-ending sirens, I figured a break in the woods might actually do me some good. It wasn't an easy decision to make. The thought of being isolated, cut off from the world I knew, sent a shiver down my spine. Yet as I stood in the ER one night, my hands shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep, I knew something had to change. So when my brother Darren suggested I borrow his cabin in northern Michigan, I decided to take him up on it. It was the summer of 2006, and I'd just finished a brutal stretch of night shifts. I was worn out, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. The idea of spending a week away from the city, in the quiet of the forest, sounded perfect, or at least as perfect as it could be for someone like me. "You'll love it, Mark," Darren had said, his voice crackling over the phone. "It's peaceful up there. No sirens, no crowds, just you and nature." I'd heard good things about Darren's place. It sat on the edge of the Huron National Forest, a small, simple cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and trails. He'd bought it a few years back as a getaway spot, somewhere to escape the pressures of his high-stress job in finance. I'd always declined his invitations to join him, but now, as I packed my bag and loaded up my old Ford Taurus, I found myself looking forward to the solitude. The drive up was long but uneventful. I left Detroit early on a Friday morning, the city slowly giving way to suburbs, then farmland, and finally the dense forests of northern Michigan. As I drove, I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The landscape became more rugged, more wild, and I found myself paying more attention to the scenery than I had in years. I arrived just before noon, following Darren's hand-drawn map down a winding dirt road. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd imagined, a rustic structure of weathered wood and stone. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering pines and oaks. As I stepped out of the car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. No car horns, no distant sirens, just the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms off to the side. Darren had left a note on the counter, along with a set of keys and a well-worn trail map. "Welcome to the wilderness, bro," the note read. "Make yourself at home. Don't forget to lock up at night, and keep an eye out for coyotes. They've been getting a little too bold lately. Enjoy the peace and quiet." I smiled at Darren's enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The silence that had seemed so peaceful outside now felt oppressive within the cabin's walls. I was used to the constant background noise of the city. This absolute quiet was almost unnerving. Shaking off the feeling, I unpacked my bags and decided to explore the surrounding area. The trail map showed several hiking routes of varying difficulty. I chose an easy one, a 2-mile loop that would bring me back to the cabin before sunset. As I set out, I tried to focus on the beauty around me. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I could hear birds calling in the distance, their songs unfamiliar to my city-trained ears. But despite the tranquil setting, I couldn't fully relax. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see, what? A bear? A mountain lion? Or just the ghosts of my own urban paranoia? By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it out of habit. As darkness fell, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled into one of the worn armchairs with a book from Darren's collection of mystery novels. The crackling of the fire and the soft turning of pages were the only sounds in the cabin. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive with unfamiliar noises, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of what I assumed were coyotes. I tried to lose myself in the book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I finally crawled into bed that night, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was safe here, safer than I'd ever been in the city. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I'd start to relax and enjoy this retreat for what it was, a much-needed break from the stress of my everyday life. Little did I know that the real nightmare was yet to begin. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. For a moment I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings jarring after years of waking up in my cramped city apartment. But as the events of the previous day came back to me, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and stepped out onto the cabin's small porch. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was nice, different, but nice. After breakfast, I decided to tackle one of the longer hiking trails. This one, according to Darren's map, would take me deeper into the forest, past a small lake, and back to the cabin in a roughly 5-hour loop. I packed a light lunch, filled a water bottle, and set out. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding through dense stands of pine and hardwood. As I walked, I found myself paying attention to details I would have overlooked in the city. The varied textures of tree bark, the intricate patterns of lichen on rocks, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy above. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I'd expected, more of a large pond really, but breathtakingly beautiful. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding trees and sky like a mirror. I sat on a fallen log at the water's edge, eating my lunch and simply being. For the first time in years, I felt the constant background noise in my head, the mental catalog of worries, responsibilities, and anxieties, begin to quiet. As I made my way back to the cabin, I realized I was actually enjoying myself. The forest no longer seemed as threatening as it had the day before. Instead, it felt alive in a way that was both alien and oddly comforting. That evening, as I sat by the fire with another of Darren's mystery novels, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The silence that had unnerved me the previous night now seemed peaceful. I even left the porch light off, allowing myself to be enveloped in the natural darkness of the forest night. It was just after midnight when I first noticed it, a strange, almost metallic smell in the air. At first I thought maybe it was coming from some old pipes in the cabin, but as I moved around, sniffing, I realized it seemed to be coming from outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees around the cabin with more force than before. I chalked it up to the weather and went back to my book, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. An hour later, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it, a sound from outside, something moving around the side of the cabin. I froze, listening intently. It didn't sound like the coyotes Darren had mentioned. There was no yipping or howling, just heavy footsteps, too heavy for an animal that size. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, as if whatever was out there was pacing. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay still, listening, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was a bear, I thought. They weren't common in this area, but not unheard of. The pacing stopped near the front porch, and I could hear something breathing. It was a deep, uneven sound, like someone gasping for air after running for miles. The metallic smell from earlier returned, only stronger now, filling the cabin with that sharp, unnatural tang. I slowly reached for my flashlight, inching toward the window. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to not look, but I had to know what was out there. I had to see it for myself. When I peeked through the blinds, what I saw froze the blood in my veins. There, crouched near the porch steps, was a shape. But it wasn't a bear or a coyote or anything I'd ever seen before. It was big, much bigger than any natural predator in these woods. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, but even in the dim light, I could see that the fur was wrong somehow, patchy in places, with what looked like bare, leathery skin showing through. The shape was hunched over, its back arched at an impossible angle, long limbs splayed out in a way that seemed to defy the normal laws of anatomy. And then it turned its head, and I saw its face. God help me, I saw its face. Its head was vaguely canine in shape, elongated and narrow, but that's where any resemblance to a normal animal ended. Its mouth was wrong. It reminded me of a crocodile's maw, stretched wide and filled with rows of jagged, crooked teeth that stuck out in every direction. But it wasn't just the mouth. The creature had this strange, leathery skin around its snout, almost like it was a patchwork of different animals stitched together by some mad taxidermist. But worst of all were its eyes. They were too large for its skull, bulging out obscenely, and they glowed with an unnatural yellowish light. And in those eyes I saw something that chilled me to my core. Intelligence. This wasn't just some animal. Whatever this thing was, it was thinking, reasoning, hunting. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my trembling hands. It clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the silent cabin. Outside, the creature's head snapped toward the noise, those glowing eyes fixing on the window where I stood. For a moment we stared at each other, man and monster, separated only by a thin pane of glass. Then, with a sound that was part growl and part scream, it lunged toward the cabin. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just reacted. I ran to the bedroom, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp the doorknob. I slammed the door behind me and wedged a chair under the handle, for all the good it would do against that thing. From the main room, I could hear the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. It was inside. Oh God, it was inside the cabin. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on the rifle mounted above the bedroom's small fireplace. Darren's hunting rifle. I'd never fired a gun in my life, but at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I grabbed the rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded with trembling hands. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, but whatever it wasn't natural, and if it could bleed, maybe, just maybe, I could hurt it. The scratching at the bedroom door began, accompanied by that awful, raspy breathing. The door shuddered in its frame as the creature threw its weight against it. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Please," I whispered, though to whom or what I couldn't say. "Please just let me wake up. Let this all be a nightmare." But as the door began to splinter, I knew with terrible certainty that this was no dream. This was real, and if I wanted to survive, I would have to fight. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and the monster burst into the room. I fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature staggered, dark blood oozing from a wound in its shoulder, but it didn't go down. Instead, it fixed those horrible yellow eyes on me and let out a roar that shook the walls of the cabin. I fired again and again, my ears ringing, my vision blurred by tears of terror. The creature advanced, seemingly shrugging off shots that would have dropped any normal animal. It was almost on me, its fetid breath hot on my face when I fired one last desperate shot. The bullet caught the monster in the eye, and it reared back with a shriek of pain and rage. It thrashed about the room, smashing furniture and leaving deep gouges in the walls with its claws. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and fled, crashing through the window and disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, shaking, the empty rifle still clutched in my hands. The cabin was a wreck, splattered with the creature's dark blood. The metallic smell hung heavy in the air, mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder. I don't know how long I remained frozen like that. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. But eventually, as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I managed to lower the rifle and take stock of my situation. I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. But I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I grabbed my phone and dialed Darren's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before he picked up, his voice groggy with sleep. "Mark, what's going on? It's not even 5 in the morning." "Darren," I said, my voice cracking. "Darren, I need you to listen to me. Something happened at the cabin, something bad." There was a pause, and when Darren spoke again, all traces of sleep were gone from his voice. "Are you hurt? Do you need me to call for help?" "No, I'm okay. But the cabin, Darren, there's something out here, something not natural. I need to get out of here, now." "Mark, you're not making sense. What do you mean, something not natural?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I can't explain it over the phone. You wouldn't believe me if I did. But I'm leaving, Darren. I'm sorry about the cabin, but I can't stay here another minute." There was another long pause. When Darren spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "Okay, Mark, okay. Get out of there if you feel you need to, but be careful on the drive back. You sound pretty shaken up." "Yeah," I said, looking out at the forest, now seemingly peaceful in the growing light of dawn. "Yeah, I will be. I'll call you when I get back to the city." I hung up and quickly gathered my things, leaving behind anything I couldn't easily carry. As I stepped out onto the porch, I half expected to see the creature waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest, birds beginning their morning songs as if nothing had happened. I got into my car and started the engine, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. As I pulled away from the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shape just at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. but when I blinked, it was gone. I drove straight back to Detroit without stopping, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. By the time I reached the familiar streets of the city, the sun was high in the sky, and the horrors of the night seemed almost like a distant nightmare. But I knew it had been real. The torn clothes, the scratches on my arms, the lingering smell of that creature's blood. It was all evidence of the nightmare I'd lived through. I spent the next few days in a daze, jumping at every sudden noise, seeing shadows move in the corner of my eye. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of dealing with emergencies when I could barely keep myself together. Darren came to see me the day after I got back. He listened to my story with a mix of concern and disbelief on his face. To his credit, he didn't laugh it off or tell me I was crazy, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Look, Mark," he said after I'd finished recounting the events at the cabin, "I believe that you believe what you saw. But are you sure it wasn't just a bear? Or maybe a wolf? You said yourself you're not used to being in the woods." I shook my head vehemently. "Darren, I know what I saw. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. It was something else." Darren sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay. Look, I'm going to head up there this weekend, check out the damage. Maybe I'll find some tracks or something that can explain what happened." Part of me wanted to beg him not to go, to warn him about the danger. But another part, the part that was still trying to rationalize what had happened, hoped he might find some evidence that could explain away the horror of that night. The days passed slowly. I found myself obsessively researching cryptids and local legends, looking for anything that might match what I'd seen, but nothing quite fit. The closest I could find were stories of the Michigan Dogman, a werewolf-like creature said to haunt the forests of northern Michigan. But even those accounts didn't capture the otherworldly wrongness of the thing I'd encountered. A week after my return, Darren called. He sounded shaken. "Mark," he said, his voice unsteady, I owe you an apology. I went up to the cabin and... Jesus, Mark, what the hell happened up there?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did you see, Darren?" "The cabin is trashed, just like you said. There's blood everywhere. I found tracks outside, but they're like nothing I've ever seen. They start off looking almost like wolf prints, but then they change, become more, more human-like. And the size of them, Mark, whatever made those tracks had to be huge." I closed my eyes, relief and fear warring within me. "Did you see it? The creature?" "No," Darren said. "No, thank God, but I found something else. In the woods, not far from the cabin, there was this den, I guess you'd call it. But Mark, it was full of bones, animal bones mostly, but I think I saw human remains in there too." My blood ran cold. "Human? Darren, we need to call the police." "I did," he said. "They're treating it as a bear attack for now. But Mark, I don't think this was a bear. I don't know what it was, but I'm selling the cabin. I can't have anything to do with that place anymore." After I hung up with Darren, I sat in silence for a long time, trying to process everything. Part of me was relieved that there was evidence, that it hadn't all been in my head, but mostly I was terrified, because now I knew for certain the creature was real, and it was still out there. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't let it go. The idea that this thing was out there, potentially hurting or killing people, gnawed at me. My work as an EMT had instilled in me a deep-seated need to help others, to protect them from harm. And now, knowing what I knew, how could I just go back to my normal life? I started digging deeper, reaching out to local historians, folklorists, anyone who might have information about similar sightings or incidents in the area. Most dismissed me as a crackpot, but a few seemed genuinely interested in my story. One of these was Dr. Elena Rossi, a cryptozoologist from the University of Michigan. When I first contacted her, I expected to be laughed off. Instead, she listened to my account with rapt attention. "Mr. Harrigan," she said after I'd finished, "what you're describing matches, at least in part, with several accounts I've collected over the years. People have been reporting sightings of an unusual, aggressive creature in that part of the Huron National Forest for decades." My heart raced. "Do you know what it is?" Dr. Rossi sighed. Honestly, no. The descriptions vary too much to pinpoint exactly what we're dealing with. Some accounts match yours quite closely. A large, wolf-like creature with unnatural features. Others describe something more bear-like or even primate-like. But there are common threads: the size, the aggression, the sense of wrongness that witnesses report. She paused, then added, "There's something else you should know. Every few years there are disappearances in that area. Hikers, campers, they go into the woods and never come out. The officials usually write it off as people getting lost or animal attacks. But given what you've told me, I felt sick. You think this thing is responsible?" "I can't say for certain," Dr. Rossi said carefully, "but I think it's a possibility we can't ignore." Over the next few months, Dr. Rossi and I worked together, compiling reports, mapping sightings, trying to build a clearer picture of what we were dealing with. We even made a few trips back to the area, though never staying overnight, always leaving well before sunset. We found more dens, similar to the one Darren had discovered, always hidden away in the deepest parts of the forest, always filled with bones. We collected samples, had them analyzed. Most were animal remains, but there were human bones too. Not many, but enough to confirm our worst fears. As our investigation deepened, so did the mystery. We found old newspaper clippings dating back to the early 1900s, describing a wolf bear that had terrorized local communities. We uncovered Native American legends of a shape-shifting beast that haunted the forests, preying on the unwary. But for every piece of evidence we found, new questions arose. Why hadn't this creature been discovered by mainstream science? How had it managed to remain hidden for so long? And perhaps most disturbingly, was it unique? Or were there more of its kind out there? It was a year to the day after my encounter at the cabin when things came to a head. Dr. Rossi and I had planned an extended research trip, intending to set up camera traps in some of the areas where we'd found signs of the creature's presence. We were deep in the forest, farther from any trails or roads than we'd ever ventured before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We knew we should head back, but we'd found fresh tracks, larger and clearer than any we'd seen before. And the temptation to follow them was too great. That was when we heard it. That same rasping, uneven breathing that had haunted my nightmares for the past year. Dr. Rossi froze, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Mark," she whispered, "we need to leave. Now." But it was too late. From the deepening shadows of the forest a shape emerged. It was the creature, exactly as I remembered it. The matted fur, the twisted limbs, the crocodilian mouth filled with jagged teeth. And those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, fixed on us with predatory intelligence. What happened next was a blur of action and terror. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's roars echoing behind us. I could hear it gaining on us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. We broke into a small clearing, and I realized with horror that we'd run in a circle. Ahead of us loomed the dark mouth of one of the dens we'd discovered earlier. We were trapped. As the creature burst into the clearing, Dr. Rossi stumbled, crying out in pain. Without thinking, I turned back, placing myself between her and the advancing monster. In that moment, facing the embodiment of my deepest fears, something changed within me. The terror was still there, but it was overpowered by a surge of determination. I'd spent the past year learning about this creature, understanding it. Now it was time to face it. I grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, brandishing it like a club. The creature hesitated, seemingly surprised by my stand. It circled us slowly, those eerie eyes never leaving mine. And then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a guttural, rasping approximation of human speech, but the words were clear enough. "Why do you hunt me?" I stood there, frozen in shock. Behind me I heard Dr. Rossi's sharp intake of breath. The creature continued to circle, but it made no move to attack. Finding my voice, I replied, We're trying to understand. What are you? Where did you come from?" The creature's mouth twisted in what might have been a grimace or a smile. It was impossible to tell. "Old," it growled. "Older than your kind. We sleep, wake, hunt, cycle of ages." Dr. Rossi spoke up, her voice trembling but curious. "There are more of you?" The creature's gaze shifted to her. Few, scattered, hidden. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but before I could voice any of them, the creature's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring. It looked back at us, and for a moment I thought I saw something almost like regret in those alien eyes. "Others come," it growled. "Hunters, with guns. You go, now." With that, it turned and loped off into the forest, disappearing as swiftly and silently as it had appeared. In the distance we could hear voices and see flashlights bobbing through the trees. A search party, probably alerted by concerned friends when we didn't return on schedule. As we were led back to safety, Dr. Rossi and I exchanged a look of silent agreement. What had happened in that clearing would stay between us. The world wasn't ready for the truth, not yet. In the years that followed, Dr. Rossi and I continued our research, but more discreetly. We never saw the creature again, but we found signs of its presence, and of others like it, in wilderness areas across the country. I never returned to emergency medicine. Instead, I joined Dr. Rossi in her cryptozoology work, using my medical background to lend credibility to our more outlandish findings. We've never gone public with the full truth of what we discovered in those woods. Who would believe us? But sometimes when I'm in the city late at night, I catch a whiff of that metallic scent on the air, and I wonder, are they out there, these ancient creatures, watching us from the shadows? And what will happen when their time comes again? As for me, I've made my peace with the unknown. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation, and sometimes the best we can do is to face our fears, seek the truth, and hope that in understanding, we might find a way to coexist with the mysteries that surround us. But I still check under my bed every night, just in case. I've never been the kind of guy to scare easy. Spent most of my life working as a paramedic in small towns and rural areas, seeing some of the most bizarre injuries and accidents you can imagine. But in 2011, after a particularly tough year, I took a break from it all. That's how I ended up spending a few weeks at my cousin's old cabin deep in the forests of northern Idaho. Needed to clear my head, get away from the chaos, and maybe learn how to relax for once. My name's Jack Holloway, and I've been a paramedic for the better part of 15 years. I've seen things that would make most people's stomachs turn, mangled bodies from car wrecks, overdoses that left people more corpse than human, and freak accidents that defy explanation. But it was the last call of 2010 that finally got to me. It was a crisp December night, just a few days before New Year's. My partner Sarah and I got a call about a house fire on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, the place was already engulfed in flames. The fire department was doing their best to contain it, but it was clear from the start that the house was a lost cause. As we approached, a frantic woman ran up to us, her face streaked with soot and tears. "My baby," she screamed. "My baby's still inside." Before anyone could stop me, I was running towards the burning building. The heat was intense, the smoke so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I heard Sarah yelling after me, but I couldn't turn back. Not when there was a chance I could save that child. I won't go into the details of what I found inside that house. Some things are better left unsaid. But I'll never forget the weight of that small body in my arms as I carried her out, or the silence that fell over the crowd when they saw us emerge from the flames. We did everything we could, Sarah and I, CPR, adrenaline, every trick in the book. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, it's just not enough. The girl didn't make it. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her mother's screams. The what-ifs plagued me day and night. What if I'd been faster? What if we'd arrived sooner? What if? That's when I knew I needed a break. I couldn't keep going like this, second-guessing every decision, seeing ghosts around every corner. So when my cousin Rory offered up his old cabin for a few weeks, I jumped at the chance. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding. As I left the highway and turned onto increasingly narrow and bumpy forest roads, I felt the weight of the past year starting to lift from my shoulders. The trees grew denser, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun. By the time I spotted the small clearing where the cabin stood, it was already getting dark. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden shack built by my uncle back in the 80s. A single room with creaky floorboards and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't seen action in years. But it was peaceful, nestled far from the nearest town. The air was crisp, and the only noise was the occasional rustle of leaves or a squirrel darting up a tree. I parked my old pickup truck next to the cabin and grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat. The key was right where Rory said it would be, hidden under a loose board on the porch. As I unlocked the door, a musty smell wafted out, the unmistakable scent of a place long unused. Inside, a thin layer of dust covered everything. I dropped my bag on the floor and took a look around. There was a small kitchenette in one corner, complete with an ancient-looking gas stove and a sink that I hoped still worked. A rickety table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a single bed, its sheets yellowed with age. A bookshelf filled with old paperbacks and fishing magazines stood next to it. I spent the next hour or so cleaning up, wiping down surfaces and shaking out the bedsheets. By the time I was done, the place looked a bit more livable. I unpacked my supplies, mostly canned food and some basic toiletries, and settled in for the night. As I lay in bed that first night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The darkness was absolute, unmarred by streetlights or passing cars. The silence was broken only by the gentle hooting of an owl somewhere in the distance. For the first time in a long while, I drifted off to sleep without seeing the faces of those I couldn't save. I woke early the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. For a moment I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings throwing me off. Then I remembered where I was, and a slow smile spread across my face. No sirens, no dispatcher's voice crackling over the radio, no life or death decisions to make. Just me, the woods, and all the time in the world. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. Rory had mentioned a small lake nearby, perfect for fishing if I was so inclined. I grabbed the old fishing rod I'd found propped up in a corner of the cabin and set out. The forest was dense, the ground covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled my footsteps. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the scent of evergreens and damp earth. As I walked, I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to reconnect with nature, to remember that there was more to life than the constant rush of emergencies and split-second decisions. It took me about 20 minutes to find the lake. It was smaller than I'd expected, more of a large pond really, but the water was crystal clear. I could see fish darting beneath the surface, their scales flashing in the sunlight. I spent the next few hours attempting to fish, more for the peace of the activity than any real hope of catching anything. My casting was terrible, and I'm pretty sure I scared away more fish than I attracted, but it didn't matter. For the first time in months, I felt myself truly relax. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I packed up my gear and headed back to the cabin. The walk back seemed shorter somehow, and I made it just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees. I heated up a can of soup on the old gas stove and settled in for the night with one of the dog-eared paperbacks from the shelf. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend the morning exploring the woods around the cabin. In the afternoons, I'd read or attempt to fish, letting the quiet of the forest seep into my bones. At night, I'd sit on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one, marveling at how many more were visible here than back in the city. It was on the third night that things started to change. I'd fallen asleep reading, the book still open on my chest. Something woke me, a sound that didn't fit with the usual nighttime noises of the forest. I lay there for a moment, trying to place it. Then I heard it again, a low rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from outside, a slow, deliberate pattern against the side of the cabin. My first thought was that it must be a branch blown by the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was too regular, too consistent for that. I sat up, suddenly wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The paramedic in me, always alert for signs of danger, was on high alert. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. Thump, Thump, thump. It continued, unrelenting. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The thumping seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. As I moved towards the door, the sound suddenly stopped. For a long moment I stood there in the darkness, listening. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, seemed to have ceased. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The moon was bright, casting everything in a ghostly light. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching towards the star-filled sky. But there was something off about the scene, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then it hit me, the stillness. There wasn't so much as a whisper of wind. The leaves on the trees hung motionless, as if frozen in time. The usual chorus of night creatures was conspicuously absent. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the dim light, but saw nothing out of place. No movement, no signs of any animal large enough to have made that sound. Just the endless expanse of the forest, silent and watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt very exposed standing there on the porch. The silence pressed in on me, making me acutely aware of just how isolated I was out here. How far from help. I don't know how long I stood there trying to convince myself to laugh it off, to go back inside and forget about it. But something about the night didn't feel right. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the cold drove me back inside. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't bothered to do since arriving, and crawled back into bed. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, it was filled with uneasy dreams of dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the events of the night seeming like a distant dream in the light of day. I went about my usual routine, coffee, a bit of reading, a walk in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As I circled back towards the cabin in the late afternoon, I decided to check around the exterior. If something had been thumping against the walls last night, surely there would be some sign of it. I started at the front and worked my way around, examining the weathered wood closely. There were no marks, no scratches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there. I was almost ready to chalk the whole thing up to an overactive imagination when I reached the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me suddenly, a wave of putrid air that made my stomach turn. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, the kind of smell that clings to your nostrils and lingers long after its source is gone. I'd encountered it often enough in my work as a paramedic, usually in cases where we arrived too late to help. But this was different, stronger, more pungent, and it wasn't coming from the forest as I'd first thought. No, this smell seemed to be wafting up from somewhere beneath the cabin itself. I covered my nose with my shirt, fighting back the urge to gag as I crouched down by the edge of the porch. The space under the cabin was low, barely high enough for a medium-sized dog to crawl into. It was dark under there, the shadows deep and impenetrable. For a moment I hesitated. Part of me, the part that had been on edge since last night, was screaming at me to leave it alone, to go back inside and pretend I hadn't noticed anything. But curiosity and a sense of professional duty won out. If there was something dead under there, it needed to be dealt with. I went back inside and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and shone the light into the cramped space beneath the cabin. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There was something there, all right, but it didn't look like any animal carcass I'd ever encountered. It was a mass of dark fur, matted with what looked like dried blood and caked with dirt, but the shape was all wrong. It was too big to be a raccoon or a fox, and the wrong shape for a deer or a bear. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. Amidst the tangled fur and congealed blood, there was something that looked disturbingly like a human hand. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew what I'd seen. For a long moment I stood there, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? That I'd found what looked like a body under my cousin's cabin, but I wasn't sure because I was too scared to look closely. And even if I did call, how long would it take them to get out here? In the end, my training took over. As a paramedic, I'd been in plenty of situations that most people would find horrifying. I'd seen death up close in all its brutal reality. If there was even a chance that what was under there was a person, I had a duty to check. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and crawled under the cabin. The smell was overwhelming in the confined space, and I had to fight the urge to retch. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything that might be evidence. As I got closer, the beam of my flashlight revealed more details, and with each new discovery my confusion grew. What I'd thought was a human hand was actually a paw, a massive clawed appendage that looked like it belonged on some prehistoric beast rather than any animal I'd ever encountered. The fur was thick and coarse, unlike anything I'd ever felt before, and as I shone my light further up what I assumed was the creature's body, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Protruding from the matted fur was what looked like the shaft of an arrow, not a modern hunting arrow, but something crude and primitive with a stone tip and feathered shaft. It was buried deep in what I guessed was the creature's shoulder, the area around it a mess of dried blood and pus. I backed out from under the cabin as quickly as I could, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. This was no ordinary animal, that much was clear. But what was it? And more importantly, what had killed it? The arrow suggested human involvement, but who would be hunting out here with such primitive weapons? As I stood there, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart, a new thought occurred to me. If this thing had been killed by humans, where were they now? And why had they left the carcass here under my cousin's cabin? The forest suddenly seemed much darker, much more threatening. Every shadow could be hiding a threat. Every rustle of leaves could be someone or something watching me. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound. I kept expecting to hear that rhythmic thumping again, or to see some monstrous shape emerge from the trees. But as the sun began to set, nothing had happened. The forest remained as peaceful and quiet as it had been since I arrived. That night I double-checked all the locks and pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The cabin that had felt like a peaceful retreat just days ago now seemed like a fragile shelter in a suddenly hostile wilderness. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I knew I was jolting awake to a sound that made my blood run cold. Thump, thump, thump. It was back. The thumping was different this time. Not the slow rhythmic sound from before, but something frantic and desperate. It was as if whatever was out there was trying to claw its way inside. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The noise was coming from the back of the cabin, near where I'd found the thing under the porch. As I listened, I could hear other sounds mixed in with the thumping, a low, guttural growling, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. For a moment I was paralyzed with fear. This was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, not in all my years as a paramedic. But as the sounds grew louder, more insistent, I knew I couldn't just lie there and wait for whatever it was to break in. I grabbed the old hunting knife I'd found in the kitchen drawer earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My knuckles were white as I gripped the handle, straining my ears to track the movement outside. The thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, ragged breathing. It was right outside the back door now. I could hear the wood creaking under its weight as it shifted its bulk. I stood there, knife raised, every muscle in my body tense. Should I make a run for it, try to sneak out the front door and make it to my truck? But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it was hopeless. Whatever was out there would be on me before I could start the engine. Suddenly a loud crack split the air. The back door burst inward with a force that sent splinters flying across the room. The impact knocked me backward, and I scrambled to regain my footing, my eyes wide with terror. Something was in the doorway. In the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, I could make out a hulking shape. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, its body covered in coarse, matted fur. Its head was low to the ground, reminiscent of a bull about to charge, but there was something off about its shape. The snout was long, almost canine, but with a flatness that reminded me of a wild boar. Its breath came in ragged gasps, visible as steamy clouds in the cold night air. The stench that emanated from it was overwhelming, the same smell of decay I'd encountered earlier, but mixed with something else, something musky and animal. For a split second, we both stood frozen, me paralyzed with fear, and the creature seeming almost surprised to find someone inside. Then, with a bone-chilling roar, it charged. I barely had time to react. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as the creature barreled past me. It crashed into the kitchen table, sending chairs flying. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature was faster than I expected, especially given its size. It recovered quickly, whirling around to face me again. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its eyes, yellow and glowing with an unnatural intelligence. I backed away, my grip tightening on the knife. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering my words. For a moment I dared to hope that it might understand, that there might be some spark of reason behind those feral eyes. That hope was shattered as it lunged at me again. This time I wasn't quick enough. A clawed paw swiped at my leg, and I felt a searing pain as its talons raked across my thigh. I cried out, stumbling backwards and crashing into the overturned table. The creature was on me in an instant, its massive weight pinning me to the ground. Its face was inches from mine now, and I could see every detail of its grotesque features. The jaw unhinged with a sound like cracking bones, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth more suited for ripping than chewing. The heat of its breath washed over me, carrying with it the stench of rotting meat. In that moment, staring into the maw of this impossible creature, I was certain I was going to die. But some deep-seated survival instinct kicked in. My hand, still clutching the knife, shot upward almost of its own accord. The blade sank into the thick, matted fur of the creature's neck. It let out a howl of pain, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. But it didn't stop. It thrashed wildly, its claws raking across my chest as it tried to dislodge the knife. I held on with every ounce of strength I had left, twisting the blade deeper. Hot, thick blood poured over my hand, making the knife handle slippery. The creature's movements became more frantic, more desperate. Its weight shifted, and I saw my chance. With a yell that was part pain and part primal rage, I shoved upward with all my might. The creature, already off balance, toppled to the side. I scrambled away, my back hitting the wall as I watched it thrash on the floor. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I sat there watching as the life slowly drained from the monstrous being. Its movements became weaker, its breathing more labored. Finally, with one last, shuddering breath, it went still. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart. The pain from my injuries, dulled by adrenaline during the fight, now came roaring back. I looked down at myself, wincing at the sight of the deep gashes on my leg and chest. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. I limped over to where my backpack lay, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. It took me 3 tries to unlock it, my blood-slicked fingers slipping on the screen. I dialed Rory's number, praying he would pick up. After what felt like an eternity, I heard his groggy voice. "Jack, do you know what time it is?" "Rory," I gasped, still struggling to catch my breath. "Something attacked me at the cabin. I don't know what it is. It's not an animal I recognize. I had to kill it. It's here in the cabin." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Rory spoke again, his voice was low, serious. "I'll be there in a few hours. Don't touch anything else. And Jack, stay inside. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, stay inside until I get there." The call ended, leaving me standing in the wreckage of the cabin, staring at the lifeless form of a creature that shouldn't exist. As the adrenaline wore off, the pain and exhaustion hit me like a wave. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. What had I just fought? What was this thing that looked like it had stepped out of a nightmare? And why did Rory's reaction make me feel like this wasn't over? As I sat there, waiting for dawn and whatever answers Rory might bring, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I would never look at the world the same way again. The hours until dawn crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every rustle of leaves outside sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature's massive form, half expecting it to spring back to life at any moment. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I used the opportunity to tend to my wounds as best I could with the limited first aid supplies I had on hand. The gashes on my leg and chest were deep, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. I knew I'd need proper medical attention soon, but for now it would have to do. It was mid-morning when I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. I tensed, gripping the blood-stained knife tightly, but relaxed when I recognized Rory's old Jeep pulling up in front of the cabin. Rory burst through the door, his face pale and drawn. He took in the scene, the overturned furniture, the blood-spattered floor, and finally the monstrous corpse in the center of the room. His eyes widened, but I was surprised to see that he didn't seem as shocked as I expected. "Jesus, Jack," he breathed, running a hand through his hair. I hoped you'd never have to deal with this." I stared at him, confusion and anger warring inside me. "You knew," I managed to croak out. "You knew about these things?" Rory sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 40 years. "Not exactly. I knew there was something in these woods, something that wasn't natural, but I never saw one up close, not like this." He crouched down next to the creature, examining it with a mix of fear and fascination. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said softly, "about creatures in the deep woods, things that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. Most of us thought they were just tall tales, meant to keep us kids from wandering too far into the forest. But you believed them," I said. It wasn't a question. Rory nodded slowly. "I saw things, tracks that didn't match any animal I knew, heard noises at night that made my hair stand on end, but I never had proof. Not until now." He stood up, turning to face me. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I should have warned you. I didn't think they'd come this close to the cabin. They usually stay deep in the woods." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to shout at him for putting me in danger, for not telling me what I might be facing out here. But looking at Rory's haunted expression, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the attack. "What are they, Rory?" He shook his head. "I don't know, not for sure. Grandpa used to call them the Old Ones, said they were here long before us, and they'd be here long after we're gone. He said they were guardians of the forest, but also its greatest predators." I thought back to the arrow I'd seen in the carcass under the cabin. "Someone's hunting them," I said. Rory's expression darkened. "Yeah, there's a group. They call themselves the Watchers. They've been tracking and hunting these creatures for generations. They're the ones who put up the warning signs deeper in the forest, the ones that keep most folks from wandering too far." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the creature. "But lately something's changed. The creatures are getting bolder, coming closer to populated areas. And the Watchers, they're getting more aggressive in their hunting. It's like a war is brewing right under everyone's noses." I tried to process all this information, my mind reeling. It was like the world I thought I knew had suddenly shifted, revealing a hidden layer of reality I never could have imagined. "What do we do now?" I asked, gesturing at the creature's body. Rory's expression was grim. "We need to get rid of it. And then we need to decide what side we're on." I blinked at him, confused. "Side? What do you mean?" "This isn't over, Jack," Rory said, his voice low and serious. "That creature? It wasn't alone. And the Watchers? They're going to want to know what happened here. We're in the middle of something big, something ancient. And now that you've seen it, now that you've fought one, you're a part of it too." As the weight of his words sank in, I realized that my life had changed far more dramatically than I'd initially thought. This wasn't just about one night of terror, one impossible creature. This was about a hidden world, a secret war that had been raging in the shadows for who knows how long. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was caught right in the middle of it. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Rory and I worked in grim silence to dispose of the creature's body, burying it deep in the woods far from the cabin. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, unseen eyes following our every move from the dense forest around us. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We made our way back to the cabin, both of us exhausted and on edge. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Back at the cabin, Rory helped me properly clean and bandage my wounds. As he worked, he filled me in on more details about the hidden world I'd stumbled into. The creatures, the old ones, they've been here for centuries, maybe longer, he explained. They keep to themselves mostly, deep in the wildest parts of the forest, but they're fiercely territorial. If they think their domain is being threatened, they'll attack. And the Watchers? I asked, wincing as he tightened a bandage. Rory's face darkened. They're almost as old as the creatures themselves, a secret society dedicated to protecting humanity from the old ones. At least that's how they see themselves. They're the ones who've been keeping the existence of these creatures a secret all this time. I thought about this for a moment. But you said things are changing. The creatures are getting bolder, coming closer to populated areas. Why? Rory shook his head. That's the million-dollar question. Some of the Watchers think it's because of climate change or deforestation, that the creatures are being forced out of their traditional territories. Others think it's something more deliberate, that the old ones are preparing for something big. A chill ran down my spine at his words. I thought back to the terror I'd felt when faced with just one of these creatures. The idea of more of them, an entire population of these monstrous beings, was almost too much to comprehend. So what happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rory met my gaze, his expression serious. Now we have a choice to make. The Watchers will be coming. They always do when there's an incident like this. They'll want to know what happened, and they'll want to make sure we keep quiet about what we've seen. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. We could tell them everything. Let them handle it. They'd probably offer to relocate us, set us up with new identities to make sure we're safe from any retaliation from the old ones. But, I prompted, sensing there was more. But, Rory continued, if we do that, we're out. We'd never know what's really going on, never be able to do anything about it. And Jack, I'm not sure the Watchers are entirely in the right here. Some of the things I've heard about their methods. He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. A secret society with that much power, operating outside the bounds of normal society. It wasn't hard to imagine that their tactics might be less than ethical. What's the alternative? I asked. Rory's eyes met mine, and I saw a mix of fear and determination in them. We could join them, become Watchers ourselves. It would be dangerous, more dangerous than anything you've ever done, even as a paramedic. But we'd be on the front lines, able to see what's really going on and maybe make a difference. I leaned back, my mind reeling. Just days ago, my biggest concern had been trying to forget the traumas I'd seen as a paramedic. Now, I was contemplating joining a secret war against creatures out of nightmare. How long do we have to decide? I asked. Rory glanced out the window at the darkening sky. Not long. They'll be here by morning, I'd guess. We need to have our story straight by then, one way or the other. I nodded slowly, trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to run, to go back to my old life and try to forget everything I'd seen. But I knew that wasn't really an option. I'd seen too much, learned too much. There was no going back. I need some air, I said, standing up gingerly. My wounds protested, but I ignored the pain. I'm going to take a walk, try to clear my head. Rory looked like he wanted to object, but he just nodded. Don't go far, he warned. And take this. He handed me a small, intricately carved wooden whistle. If you see anything at all, blow this. I'll come running. I took the whistle, noting the strange symbols carved into its surface. Another piece of this hidden world I was now a part of. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hit me like a physical force. The forest stretched out before me, dark and mysterious. Somewhere out there, more of those creatures were moving in the shadows. And somewhere the Watchers were closing in, bringing with them a decision that would change my life forever. I walked slowly into the woods, my hand clutching the whistle Rory had given me. Every sound made me flinch, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as I walked, letting the quiet of the forest wash over me, I began to feel a strange sense of calm. I found myself at the edge of the small lake where I'd tried fishing just days ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. I sat down on a fallen log, staring out at the still water reflecting the starry sky above. As I sat there, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, the whistle halfway to my lips. What I saw made me freeze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was one of the creatures. It was smaller than the one that had attacked me, its fur a silvery gray in the moonlight. But there was no mistaking what it was. For a long moment we stared at each other. I waited for it to charge, to attack, but it didn't move. Its yellow eyes, so alien and yet somehow intelligent, studied me with what I could only describe as curiosity. Slowly, carefully, I lowered the whistle. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said softly, not even sure if it could understand me. The creature tilted its head, reminding me bizarrely of a confused dog. Then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound wasn't like any language I'd ever heard. It was a series of low growls and chirps, but there was a clear pattern to it, an undeniable intelligence behind the sounds. I sat there stunned as the creature continued to vocalize. It wasn't attacking, it wasn't even threatening, it was communicating. In that moment I understood. These weren't just animals. They weren't the mindless beasts the Watchers made them out to be. They were intelligent, with their own language, their own society. The creature took a step forward and I tensed, but it simply bent its head, picking up a stick from the ground. With movements that spoke of practiced ease, it began to scratch something in the dirt. I leaned forward, squinting in the dim light. What I saw took my breath away. It was a crude but unmistakable drawing of the forest, with symbols I didn't recognize scattered throughout. The creature looked up at me, then back at the drawing. It was showing me something, trying to tell me something. I don't know how long I sat there, watching as the creature added to its drawing, listening to its strange vocalizations, but by the time it finished and melted back into the forest, I knew what I had to do. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. Rory was pacing on the porch, his face lined with worry. "Jack, I was about to come looking for you. What happened? Did you see something?" I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Rory, we've got it all wrong. The creatures, the old ones, they're not what we think they are." I told him everything, about the creature by the lake, its attempt to communicate, the drawing. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief on Rory's face slowly give way to wonder. "So what do we do?" he asked when I finished. I took a deep breath. "We join the Watchers," I said, "but not to fight the creatures, to learn about them, to understand them, and maybe to find a way for us to coexist." Rory was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The Watchers have been fighting these creatures for generations, changing their minds, changing the way they operate. It'll be like trying to turn a battleship." "I know," I said, "but we have to try. What I saw tonight, Rory, there's so much we don't understand about these beings. If we don't at least try to communicate, to find a peaceful solution, we're no better than the monsters we think they are." As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching. The Watchers had arrived. Rory and I shared a look. This was it, the moment of truth. "You ready for this?" Rory asked. I thought about everything that had happened. The terror of the attack, the wonder of the encounter by the lake, the weight of the knowledge I now carried. I thought about the life I'd left behind and the new path stretching out before me. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "I'm ready." As we walked out to meet the Watchers, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And as I glanced back at the forest, I could have sworn I saw a pair of yellow eyes watching from the shadows, not threatening, not angry, but curious, hopeful even. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for understanding, for peace. It wouldn't be easy. It would probably be the hardest thing I'd ever done. But as I squared my shoulders and prepared to face the Watchers, I knew it was a fight worth having. The world was bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than I'd ever imagined, and I was ready to explore it, no matter where it might lead me. It was early 1994 when I found myself staring at a map, wondering how I got here. My name's Tanner Ridgway, and I was a carpenter by trade, but after a series of bad jobs and worse bosses, I decided I needed a break from the chaos of city life. A friend mentioned an old family cabin up in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, unused for years, and it seemed like the perfect getaway to clear my head. I'd always been a hands-on kind of guy, able to fix just about anything with wood and nails. But the truth is, I was running away from a mess I didn't know how to fix. Divorce papers, unpaid bills, and a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to stop the spiral and rebuild. I didn't expect it to be where I'd face something I couldn't fix with a hammer. The decision to leave hadn't come easily. For weeks I'd been drowning in a sea of self-pity and cheap whiskey, watching as my life unraveled thread by thread. It started with the argument, the last in a long line of them, with my soon-to-be ex-wife, Sarah. "You're never here, Tanner," she'd screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "Even when you are, you're not really present. It's like living with a ghost." I remember standing there, my work boots tracking sawdust across the kitchen floor she'd just cleaned. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down I knew she was right. Our marriage had been on the rocks for years. We'd met young, fell hard, and got married before either of us really knew who we were. For a while it worked. We were happy, or at least we thought we were. But as the years went by, the cracks started to show. I threw myself into my work, taking on more projects, staying later at job sites. Anything to avoid coming home to the silence that had settled between us. Sarah tried, God knows she tried, to bridge the gap. But I was too stubborn, too set in my ways to meet her halfway. The night she handed me the divorce papers, I didn't even flinch. It was like I'd been expecting it, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I signed them without a word, packed a bag, and checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. For days I wandered in a haze, showing up to work on autopilot, my mind a million miles away. It was during one of these fog-filled days that I managed to royally screw up a job, misreading the blueprints and building an entire wall in the wrong place. My boss, a red-faced man named Frank who'd always had it out for me, didn't hold back. "Ridgway," he bellowed, his face inches from mine, "you just cost us a week's worth of work and materials. What the hell were you thinking?" I stood there, taking the verbal lashing, my fists clenched at my sides. And then something inside me snapped. "You know what, Frank?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "I quit." I walked off the job site, ignoring the chorus of shouts behind me. It felt good for about 5 minutes. Then the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. No job, no wife, no home to speak of. I was adrift, untethered from everything that had once defined me. That's when I remembered the cabin. Years ago, my buddy Mike had mentioned it in passing. An old family property tucked away in the Ouachita Mountains. "It's a bit rough," he'd said, "but it's there if you ever need to get away." I called Mike that night, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. "Mike, it's Tanner. Remember that cabin you mentioned? Is it still available?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might say no, but then I heard him sigh. "Yeah, it's available, but Tanner, are you sure? It's pretty isolated up there." I almost laughed. Isolated was exactly what I needed. "I'm sure," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I just need some time to clear my head, you know." Mike was quiet for a moment, and I could almost see him running his hand through his hair, a habit he'd had since we were kids. "All right," he finally said. "I'll text you the directions. But Tanner, be careful up there. It's different." I thanked him, promising to check in regularly, and hung up. As I packed my truck with what little I owned, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. This was it, my chance to start over, to find myself again. Little did I know what I'd find in those mountains would change me forever, in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The drive to the Ouachita Mountains was long and winding, taking me through stretches of Arkansas I'd never seen before. As the cityscape faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and dense forests, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The further I got from my old life, the easier it became to breathe. I'd left early in the morning, the sky still tinged with the pink and orange hues of dawn. My old pickup truck, a '78 Ford that had seen better days, groaned in protest as I pushed it up steep inclines. But it held together, just like it always had. The radio faded in and out as I drove, catching snatches of country music and talk shows. Eventually I gave up and popped in an old Johnny Cash cassette. As I walked the line filled the cab, I found myself humming along, my fingers tapping against the steering wheel. It was mid-afternoon when I finally reached the turnoff Mike had described. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to little more than a dirt path. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck. I checked the hastily scribbled directions on the crumpled piece of paper beside me, squinting to make out Mike's chicken scratch handwriting. Left at the big oak with the split trunk, it read. I scanned the woods, my eyes peeled for anything resembling the landmark. Just as I was beginning to think I'd missed it, the trees parted, revealing a massive oak. Its trunk was indeed split, as if it had been struck by lightning long ago. I made the turn, the truck bouncing over exposed roots and rocks. The path narrowed even further, to the point where I was sure I'd have to get out and walk the rest of the way. But then, suddenly the trees gave way to a small clearing. And there it was, the cabin. My first thought was that Mike had undersold just how rough the place was. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, not just a few years. The roof had partially caved in on one side, the windows were so grimy I couldn't see through them, and the front door hung at an awkward angle, its hinges rusted and bent. For a moment I sat in the truck staring at the dilapidated structure. A part of me wanted to turn around to head back to civilization and figure out another plan. But then I remembered what I was running from, the failed marriage, the lost job, the mountain of debt. At least here I had a purpose. I could fix this place up, make it livable. It was something tangible, something I could control. I killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was different here, crisp and clean, with a hint of pine. I took a deep breath, feeling it fill my lungs. As I approached the cabin, I could hear the soft creaking of wood, the structure settling in the afternoon heat. Up close I could see that the damage wasn't as bad as it had first appeared. The roof would need work, sure, and the windows would have to be replaced. But the foundation looked solid, and most of the walls were intact. I reached out, running my hand along the rough-hewn logs that made up the cabin's exterior. Despite the years of neglect, there was something solid about it, something that had weathered the test of time. "All right," I muttered to myself, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Let's see what we're working with here." I made my way to the front door, giving it a gentle push. It groaned in protest but swung open, revealing the cabin's interior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the holes in the roof. The floor was littered with leaves and debris that had blown in over the years. But beneath the layer of grime and neglect, I could see the bones of something beautiful. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, and a ladder led up to a loft area that I assumed served as the bedroom. I spent the next hour exploring, taking mental notes of what needed to be fixed and what could be salvaged. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I headed back to the truck, retrieving my sleeping bag and a cooler filled with supplies. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As I unrolled the sleeping bag on the dusty floor, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Sarah, or the divorce, or the mess I'd left behind. Here in this run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, I had a clean slate, a chance to rebuild not just the cabin, but myself. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of the forest surrounding me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Little did I know that hope would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The next few days fell into a rhythm, a pattern of work and solitude that I found oddly comforting. I'd wake at dawn, the sunlight filtering through the gaps in the roof serving as my alarm clock. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I'd set to work. The first order of business was the roof. I'd brought along some basic tools and supplies, enough to patch the worst of the damage. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it would keep the rain out until I could do a proper job. As I worked, I found myself talking out loud, narrating my actions as if I were teaching an invisible apprentice. It was a habit I'd picked up years ago on job sites, a way to organize my thoughts and stay focused. "All right, we've got a rotted beam here," I'd mutter, running my hand along the splintered wood. "Need to cut it out and replace it. Measure twice, cut once." The physical labor was therapeutic. With each nail I drove, each shingle I replaced, I felt like I was rebuilding more than just the cabin. I was piecing myself back together, bit by bit. During breaks, I'd explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but beyond that, the forest stretched out in every direction. Towering pines and old-growth hardwoods created a canopy overhead, dappling the forest floor with patches of sunlight. I discovered a small stream about a quarter-mile from the cabin, its clear water bubbling over smooth rocks. It was here that I'd sit during the hottest part of the day, letting the cool mist from the water refresh me. One afternoon, as I was making my way back to the cabin, I stumbled upon an old shed I hadn't noticed before. It was half hidden by overgrown vines and bushes, its weathered wood blending in with the surrounding trees. Curious, I pushed aside the foliage and pried open the rusted door. The hinges groaned in protest, and for a moment I thought they might give way entirely. But they held, revealing the shed's interior. It was like stepping back in time. The small space was crammed with tools and equipment, most of it decades old. Rusty saws hung from pegs on the wall, their teeth dulled with age. An old workbench stood against one wall, its surface scarred and stained. But it was what I found in the corner that really caught my attention. Tucked away behind some old crates was a hunting rifle, its stock smooth and well-oiled despite the years of disuse. Next to it sat a box of ammunition, the cardboard faded but still intact. I picked up the rifle, feeling its weight in my hands. I'd never been much of a hunter, but I knew how to handle a gun. My dad had taught me the basics when I was a kid, emphasizing safety above all else. "Always treat it like it's loaded," his voice echoed in my head as I checked the chamber. It was empty, as I'd expected, but I still felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach. I debated whether to bring the rifle back to the cabin. On one hand, it might come in handy. There were bound to be animals in these woods, and while I had no intention of hunting, the idea of having some protection was appealing. On the other hand, the thought of having a loaded weapon around made me uneasy. In the end, I decided to leave it where it was. I could always come back for it if I needed to. I made a mental note of its location and headed back to the cabin, my mind already turning to the next repair on my list. As the days passed, I fell into a routine. Work during the day, a simple dinner as the sun set, and then evenings spent sitting on the newly repaired porch, watching as the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds. It was during one of these evenings, about a week into my stay, that I first noticed something off. I was sitting in an old rocking chair I'd found in the cabin, nursing a cup of instant coffee when I heard it. A rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. I sat up straighter, my eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. For a moment all was still. Then, from the dense tree line, I caught movement. At first I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move right. The way it shifted between the trees, low and slow, felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm evening air. Whatever it was big, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen, and it didn't seem to care that I was there. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee mug down on the porch railing. My heart was pounding, a steady drumbeat in my ears. I took a step towards the edge of the porch, squinting into the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the movement stopped. The forest fell silent, an unnatural hush descending over the clearing. Even the crickets had stopped their nightly chorus. I stood there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something. But nothing came. Eventually, the normal sounds of the night resumed, as if someone had flipped a switch. I retreated back into the cabin, double-checking that I'd locked the door behind me. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Probably just a bear or a large deer, nothing to worry about. But as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, A small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Something wasn't right in these woods. And I had a feeling I was about to find out what it was. The next few days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since that night on the porch. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor, as if keeping busy could somehow keep whatever was out there at bay. I focused on the interior of the cabin, scrubbing years of grime from the windows and floors. As I worked, I couldn't help but wonder about the cabin's history. Who had built it? Why had they abandoned it? The more I cleaned, the more traces of its past inhabitants I uncovered. A child's drawing tucked behind a loose floorboard, an old locket hidden in the back of a drawer. These glimpses into the lives of those who had come before me were a welcome distraction from my own troubled thoughts. I found myself creating stories about them in my mind, imagining their lives and the reasons they might have left this place behind. But as night fell, my unease would return. I'd find myself sitting on the porch, straining my eyes against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement in the tree line. More often than not, I'd see nothing. But sometimes, just on the edge of my vision, I'd catch a flicker of something, a shadow moving against shadows, there and gone so quickly I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. It was on the third night after my initial sighting that things took a turn. I was outside, sharpening some old tools I'd found in the shed. The repetitive motion was soothing, and I'd lost track of time, the sun long since dipped below the horizon. That's when I heard it, a rustling that was too deliberate to be the wind. I paused, my hand frozen mid-stroke on the whetstone. For a moment all was silent. Then, from the dense tree line, I caught movement. At first I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move right. The way it shifted between the trees, low and slow, felt wrong. Whatever it was big, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen, and it didn't seem to care that I was there. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I aimed the light at the tree line, the beam slicing through the thick Arkansas night. For a moment, nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the cabin, I saw it. A shape hunched low to the ground, covered in a matted dark coat that almost looked like it had patches of skin exposed. It wasn't a bear, that much I knew. The shoulders were too pronounced, too sharp, and it moved in a way that reminded me of a giant hairless wolf. It looked right at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. I wasn't sure it had any. I backed up slowly, the light from my flashlight shaking as my hand trembled. I wasn't armed except for the old hatchet I'd been using for firewood, which lay uselessly near the chopping block. The creature, or whatever it was, sniffed the air, like it was testing for something. Then, to my horror, it took a step forward, emerging fully from the tree line. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It stood on all fours, but its front legs were unnaturally long, ending in what looked like hands rather than paws. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and exposed flesh, as if it were molting. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was almost human, but grotesquely elongated, with a jaw that hung open to reveal row upon row of needle-like teeth. Where its eyes should have been, there were only sunken hollows, dark and empty. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light, anything but what I was seeing. The creature's head snapped towards me at the sound of my movement. It let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted for the cabin as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its bizarre gait producing a rhythmic thudding that spurred me on. I reached the cabin door, fumbling with the handle in my panic. Just as I felt it give way, something slammed into my back, sending me sprawling into the cabin. I rolled, coming face to face with the creature as it loomed in the doorway. For a moment we stared at each other, me gasping for breath on the floor and this impossible thing poised to strike. Then, inexplicably, it hesitated, its head tilted to the side almost quizzically, and it sniffed the air again. Taking advantage of its momentary pause, I scrambled to my feet and slammed the door shut, throwing my weight against it. I half expected the creature to burst through, to tear the door from its hinges with ease. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Gradually, the sound of my own ragged breathing subsided, and I became aware of the silence outside. No scratching at the door, no inhuman noises, nothing. Cautiously, I peered out the window. The clearing was empty, bathed in moonlight. Whatever that thing was, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the door, the hatchet clutched in my sweating palms, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax, if only a little. What had I seen? The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of it, to fit it into some category of known animals, but I knew, deep down, that what I'd encountered was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. As I watched the sun rise, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was in these woods, I didn't want to meet it again. But things never go as planned, do they? Despite my resolve to leave, I found myself paralyzed by indecision as the day wore on. The encounter from the night before seemed almost dreamlike in the harsh light of day, and I began to doubt my own memories. Had it really happened? Or was my mind, stressed and isolated, playing tricks on me? I spent the morning pacing the cabin, alternating between packing my belongings and unpacking them, unable to commit to a course of action. By midday, I had convinced myself that staying one more night wouldn't hurt. I'd be extra vigilant, I told myself, and if nothing happened, I'd leave first thing in the morning. To distract myself from my churning thoughts, I decided to finish the repairs I'd started on the roof. Physical labor had always been my way of coping with stress, and I hoped it would provide some clarity. I was up on the roof, hammering the last few nails into a set of new shingles I'd put up, when I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't rustling. It was a low, drawn-out sound, like something dragging itself through the brush. I froze, every hair on my body standing up. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the edge of the roof, peering down at the forest below. That's when I saw it again, closer this time, dragging something behind it. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. It was a man, or at least what was left of him. His body was mangled, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and his face, what was left of his face, was contorted in terror. I gagged, feeling bile rise in my throat, but forced myself to stay still. The creature dropped the man's body and sniffed the air again, like it knew I was watching. It didn't seem to care. It started tearing into the man's chest with its long, claw-like fingers, too precise for a wild animal, almost like it was dissecting him. Blood soaked the ground, and the noise it made while feeding was wet, sickening. I backed up one step at a time, until I reached the ladder I'd used to climb up. My foot hit the top rung, and the old wood creaked loudly. The creature stopped, its head snapped up, and though I still couldn't make out any eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. For a moment we were frozen in a tableau of horror. Me halfway down the ladder, and the creature, its hands deep in the corpse's chest cavity. Then, with a speed that defied its awkward shape, it began to move towards the cabin. I scrambled down the ladder, my feet barely touching the rungs, as I half climbed, half fell to the ground. I hit the earth running, bolting for the cabin door. I could hear it behind me, its bizarre gait producing that same rhythmic thudding I remembered from the night before. I reached the door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. I slammed it shut and barred it with the nearest piece of furniture I could find, an old, heavy dresser. My mind raced. I had no phone, no way to call for help. My only weapon was the hatchet, but going up against whatever that thing was seemed like a death sentence. I scanned the room for anything else useful, a hunting rifle, anything. But the cabin was barren. Then I remembered, the rifle in the shed. It was my only chance. But to get to it, I'd have to go outside, to run past that thing. The very thought made my knees weak. A loud thud against the door jolted me from my thoughts. The dresser shuddered, sliding a few inches across the floor. Another thud, and I could see the wood of the door beginning to splinter. I was out of time and out of options. I gripped the hatchet tightly, my palms slick with sweat. As the creature slammed into the door again, I made my decision. I'd make a run for the shed. It was my only chance. I positioned myself by the back door, my hand on the knob. I could hear the creature still battering at the front of the cabin, the sound of splintering wood growing louder with each impact. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. With one final, violent crash, the front door gave way. I yanked open the back door and ran, not daring to look behind me. I could hear the creature's surprised screech, followed by the sound of it scrambling to change direction. The shed seemed miles away, though I knew it was only a short distance. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. I reached the shed, practically ripping the door off its hinges in my haste to get inside. My eyes darted around frantically, searching for the rifle. Where was it? Where had I seen it? Behind me I could hear the creature approaching, its strange gait unmistakable. My hands scrabbled through old boxes, tossing aside rusted tools and moldy books. Where was the damn rifle? And then, miraculously, my hand closed around the smooth wooden stock. I yanked it free from its hiding place, fumbling to load it with the ammunition I'd found nearby. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it, but somehow I got the rounds in. I turned just as the creature reached the shed door. It filled the entrance completely, its misshapen body blocking out the light. For a moment we stared at each other, a twisted mirror of our encounter the night before. Then, slowly, deliberately, I raised the rifle. The creature cocked its head as if curious about this new development. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the shed. The creature staggered backward, a dark stain spreading across its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the shed. I fired again and again, each shot driving the creature back a step, but it kept coming, seemingly impervious to the bullets tearing through its flesh. I was down to my last round, my back pressed against the far wall of the shed. As I raised the rifle for one final shot, the creature suddenly stopped. It stood there, swaying slightly, its chest a mess of bullet holes and dark, viscous fluid. Then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. The sound it made was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a guttural, rasping noise that somehow formed words. "Not yours," it said, the words barely intelligible. "This place, not yours." Before I could process what I'd heard, the creature turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the forest with surprising speed. I stood there, the rifle still raised, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't until the sun began to set that I finally moved, my muscles stiff and aching. I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs, my mind reeling. What had the creature meant? What was this place? As I approached the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Carved into one of the logs near the door was a symbol, a complex swirling design that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked at it. I had a feeling that my time in these mountains was far from over. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever that creature was, I knew I couldn't leave until I uncovered the truth. As night fell, I barricaded myself in the cabin once more, the rifle close at hand. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something far beyond my understanding, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that discovery might mean. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic research and mounting paranoia. I couldn't shake the memory of the creature's words, nor the image of that strange symbol carved into the cabin. There was more to this place than met the eye, and I was determined to uncover its secrets. I started by thoroughly searching the cabin, looking for any clues its previous inhabitants might have left behind. I pried up floorboards, checked behind every loose panel, and combed through the few pieces of furniture that remained. My search yielded little at first, a few old newspapers, some faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. But then, hidden in a small compartment beneath a loose brick in the fireplace, I found something. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting that was difficult to decipher. I spent hours poring over the journal, piecing together its contents. It had belonged to a man named Elias Blackwood, who had lived in the cabin in the 1930s. Elias wrote of strange occurrences in the forest, of creatures that defied explanation and nights filled with unearthly sounds. But more than that, he wrote of a cult, a group that had inhabited these mountains long before white settlers arrived, practicing rituals that Elias described as an abomination against nature and God alike. According to the journal, the cult had discovered a way to bend reality itself to create creatures that existed between worlds. The symbol I had seen on the cabin was their mark, a ward meant to protect against the very things they had created. But something had gone wrong. The creatures had turned on their masters, driving them from the mountains. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Could it be true? It seemed impossible, the ravings of a madman. And yet, after what I had seen, could I really discount it? The final pages of the journal were filled with frantic scribblings, diagrams of the symbol I had seen, and warnings. "They're coming," Elias had written, the words pressed so hard into the page that they had nearly torn through. "God help me, they're coming." The journal ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers. What had happened to Elias? Had the creatures gotten him? Or had he fled, like so many others who had tried to make a home in these cursed mountains? I spent the next few days in a research frenzy, making trips into the nearest town to use the library's internet connection. I searched for any information I could find on the history of the area, on disappearances or strange sightings in the Ouachita Mountains. What I found was disturbing. Over the years, dozens of people had gone missing in these woods. Hikers, campers, even entire families vanishing without a trace. The official reports blamed it on the terrain, on wild animals or simple misadventure. But I knew better now. I also found scattered references to the cult Elias had mentioned. Nothing concrete, just whispers and rumors on obscure forums and in old dusty books. But it was enough to convince me that I was on the right track. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice things. Small things at first, the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, the eerie silence that would sometimes fall over the forest, as if every living thing was holding its breath. And then there were the dreams. Every night, I found myself wandering through misty, otherworldly landscapes, pursued by shapes I couldn't quite see. I would wake gasping, the bedsheets tangled around me, the symbol from the cabin burned into my mind's eye. As the days wore on, I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The line between waking and dreaming became blurred. More than once I caught myself sleepwalking, only coming to my senses when I found myself standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the forest. It was during one of these episodes that I made a chilling discovery. I had wandered further into the woods than ever before, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. As I came to my senses, I realized I was standing in a small, circular clearing I had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered. Its surface was carved with the same swirling symbol I had seen on the cabin, only larger and more complex. Around the altar, the ground was littered with bones, some animal, some disturbingly human. I approached the altar cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Carved into the stone, barely visible beneath years of moss and lichen, were words in a language I didn't recognize. I reached out, my fingers tracing the alien script. As I did, I felt a jolt, like static electricity run through my body, and suddenly, impossibly, I could understand the words. "The gate stands open," they read. "The worlds bleed together. What was sundered shall be whole again." As the meaning of the words sank in, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its misshapen form silhouetted against the trees. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, I could see other shapes moving in the shadows, things that defied description. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear them behind me, their unearthly cries echoing through the trees. Somehow, I made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the locks. As I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, I realized something that turned my blood to ice. They hadn't followed me. They could have easily overtaken me, but they had stopped at the edge of the clearing. It was as if they were waiting for something. That night, as I huddled in the cabin, the rifle clutched to my chest, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was happening in these mountains, whatever dark forces were at work, it was bigger than me. I needed help. But as I packed my meager belongings, a thought nagged at me. The symbol on the cabin had protected me so far. If I left, what would happen? Would the creatures be free to roam beyond the boundaries of the forest? Was I the only thing standing between them and the unsuspecting world beyond? I stood at the cabin door, my hand on the knob, torn between self-preservation and a sense of responsibility I didn't fully understand. And that's when I heard it, a sound that made my decision for me. From somewhere in the forest came a scream, a human scream. Without thinking, I grabbed the rifle and ran out into the night. The scream had come from the direction of the stone altar, and I found myself retracing my steps from earlier that day. As I approached the clearing, I could hear voices, human voices, mixed with the inhuman sounds of the creatures. I slowed, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. The scene that greeted me in the clearing was like something out of a nightmare. A group of people dressed in dark robes stood around the altar. In their midst was a young woman struggling against the ropes that bound her, and surrounding them all were the creatures, dozens of them, more than I had ever seen before. They formed a circle around the clearing, their misshapen bodies swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen wind. I watched in horror as one of the robed figures raised a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. The chanting grew louder, reaching a fevered pitch. I knew I had to act, but what could I do against so many? I was just one man with a rifle, facing down forces I barely understood. Then I remembered the words on the altar. The gate stands open. This wasn't just a ritual, it was an opening, a tearing of the veil between worlds, and somehow I knew that I was meant to close it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the clearing. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Everyone, human and creature alike, turned to look at me. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then one of the robed figures spoke. "Who dares interrupt the great joining?" I raised the rifle, aiming it at the figure with the knife. "Someone who's seen enough to know this needs to end," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, outsider. We stand on the brink of a new age. The old ones will return, and we shall be their heralds." As he spoke, I noticed something. The creatures were watching me intently, their eyeless faces turned in my direction. They seemed expectant. And suddenly I understood. They hadn't been created by the cult. They were victims, twisted and changed by the dark rituals performed here. And they were waiting for someone to end their torment. With a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, I knew what I had to do. I turned the rifle towards the altar and fired. The bullet struck the ancient stone, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world tearing apart, a crack appeared in the altar's surface. The cultists cried out in alarm, but their voices were drowned out by the screeching of the creatures. As I watched, the crack in the altar widened, spreading across its surface like a spider's web. The air itself seemed to ripple, reality bending and warping around us. The cultists tried to run, but the creatures were faster. They fell upon their former masters with a vengeance born of years of torment. I rushed to the young woman, cutting her free from her bonds. "Run!" I yelled, pushing her towards the edge of the clearing. She didn't need to be told twice. As she disappeared into the trees, I turned back to the scene of chaos before me. The altar was crumbling, pieces of stone falling away to reveal a swirling vortex of darkness beneath. The creatures were being pulled towards it, their bodies twisting and dissolving as they were sucked in. Their cries changed from rage to what sounded almost like relief. I felt the pull of the vortex myself, my feet sliding across the ground towards it. I grabbed onto a nearby tree, holding on for dear life as the wind howled around me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The vortex collapsed in on itself with a thunderous boom, leaving behind nothing but a smoking crater where the altar had stood. The clearing was empty, the cultists, the creatures, all gone. Only I remained, clinging to the tree, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs. I knew I should leave, should put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I stood on the porch looking out at the peaceful forest, I realized I couldn't. Someone needed to stand guard, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I walked back into the cabin, running my hand along the symbol carved into the log. It no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I felt a sense of purpose. This place, with all its dark history and hidden dangers, was my responsibility now, and I would protect it, no matter what came. As I settled into the rocking chair on the porch, rifle across my lap, I smiled for the first time in weeks. I had come to these mountains looking for a new start, a way to rebuild my life. I never expected to find my true calling,